The best financial advice would have been not to start a cable news network.
I got plenty of that. The best advice is never to do anything. You'll never get in trouble if you don't do anything. But on the other hand, you'll never get anywhere either, you know.
In 1980, George Babick, the head of CNN's New York sales office, was talking about his boss, Ted Turner, and said, quote, "If Ted predicted the sun will come up in the west tomorrow morning, you'd laugh and say he's full of it, but you'd still set the alarm. You wouldn't want to miss the miracle," end quote. This episode is all about that miracle, Ted Turner's cable news network. Now, in our last episode, I talked about how CNN was started as a wild, almost impossible dream, and how it became an actual living, breathing, 24/7 news network, from a long gestating kernel of an idea to its launch on June 1st, 1980. But think about what it took to get there. Ted had to build a team, the right team, with the right motivations and drive. He had to then lock down a spot on the satellite, even after their first one literally got lost in space. And he had to convince all the cable cowboys to carry his new channel that had never existed before and pay him for that right, even though no one had ever seen anything like a 24/7 news network before. And he had to fight to overcome obstacle after obstacle, the kind that would have stopped almost anyone. I would actually say everyone, except Ted Turner. Now, with all those hurdles, you'd think he had piles of research, marketing decks, forecasts, something to prove this whole thing made sense, right? Nope. Even in the early aughts, Google tested 41 shades of blue before picking one. And I've worked for plenty of bosses who let Excel call the shots. Punch in those numbers. If the math checks out, it's a go. But what do you do when there are no numbers, no data, no history, no proof, just intuition and the guts to chase it? Well, like it or not, that's really what separates the greatest entrepreneurs from merely good ones, especially in media, where things like instinct, taste, and sheer determination matter a lot more than spreadsheets. It's not just conviction, it's about seeing around corners and spotting something before anyone else does. And then, instead of dreaming or tweeting about it, actually building it, even when the odds say you shouldn't. Because when it comes to news, the idea of launching a brand new 24/7 news network in 1980 and doing it independent of the big three networks was preposterous. Think about it. The only model anyone knew before this was the 30 minutes of news each night that the networks aired at the same time in the same format with nearly identical anchors. So, where'd Ted Turner's conviction come from? Sure, he needed to own his own programming and not be at the mercy of the networks, sports leagues, Hollywood, and the government. But choosing to build a news network, given his rocky history with news, was both surprising and pretty incredible. And it's not like he was just dipping his toes into the news business, right? This wasn't cautious or in any way a half measure. No, this was a full-blown cannonball into the deep end. He was offering 23 and a half more hours of news every single day than anyone had ever seen before. Honestly, where does that kind of belief come from? He was going head-to-head with three giant networks, each of whom spent hundreds of millions of dollars a year just to produce 30 minutes of nightly news each day. And they controlled everything: distribution, advertisers, attention. CBS News President Bill Leonard asked the obvious question, quote, "Why would anybody choose to watch a patched-together news operation that's just starting against an organization like ours that's been going for 50 years and spends $100 to $150 million a year," end quote. And in my opinion, that's a totally fair question. The truth is, Ted didn't have data or marketing studies to even try to answer it, nor did he have any focus groups, research reports, or things that most people think they need before taking this kind of leap. But that's the thing. The biggest, boldest ideas, the ones that actually change the world, can't always be measured in advance, right? They're the ones where 1 + 1 somehow equals 5, where you just say, screw it, and take the leap anyway. It's like Henry Ford once said, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. Ted, of course, had his own version, quote, "Where's the fun in making a bunch of studies? I usually know what I want to do, and you have to have confidence in your own ideas. I never even did a marketing study on cable news network, which is going to cost me every penny I've got. Wait, actually, we did do one on that. It cost me $4,000 and it was done in Sarasota, Florida. But that was just for advertising. If everybody in that survey had said they hated the idea, I wouldn't have given a damn. There's never a reason for a study if your idea is conceptually sound. If I decided to move to Australia and open those McDonald's franchises and bring the good Australian people Kentucky Fried Chicken, you bet I wouldn't have done a survey there either, end quote. And then, just like it was out of a movie, he added while blowing a ring of smoke from his cigar, quote, I do my own marketing analysis. Then said, I asked a guy in Australia, hey, where's the Colonel's chicken? When he didn't know what I meant, I knew I could make $1 million within a year, end quote. Now, I'm not saying you just come up with a crazy idea, work like hell, and maybe it works. Sometimes it works that way, but it's not random. These things require building upon the past, towards the future, over time. You know, there's a saying of standing on the shoulder of giants. Like, you don't get the iPhone in 2007 without 6 years of iPods first, right? Same thing here. Without the experience of taking the Superstation nationwide via satellite in 1976, or defending cable in the Superstation in front of Congress in Episode 5, without those experiences, Ted Turner wouldn't have had the tools, the knowledge, or the nerve to build CNN. As Littlefinger said in Game of Thrones, chaos is a ladder. And for entrepreneurs like Ted Turner, going up against the system and better funded and significantly better staff competition, that was absolutely true. You go one rung at a time. In our last episode, I talked about how Ted, Reese Schonfeld, and the rest of the CNN team built that ladder. Now, we're going to tell the story of how they climbed it. Now, to me, what's amazing about CNN is this. On June 1st, 1980, as Ted Turner was about to press the button to beam 24/7 news to the world, most people, including most in the media, had no idea what was about to happen. They didn't see the implications. CNN wasn't just a new cable channel. It was a new paradigm, a new world order. Not only were time and space going to shrink once again, the wait for information was over. Immediacy had arrived. And changes like that don't fade away. They don't roll back. This was a before and after type of moment in history. Because once the genie's out of the bottle, he doesn't go back. The launch of CNN wasn't just big. It was world-changing. On June 1st, 1980, at 6 p.m., the world changed forever. The National Review described Ted Turner like this, quote, a refreshing phenomenon, a dynamic Sunbelt go-getter who testifies to the survival of those entrepreneurial energies which even the federal bureaucracy, now and then, neglect to repress. He represents a gut-level rejection of socialist presumptions and brings to his work a gambler's boldness, a set of first-class Southern wiles, and a burial confidence in his sovereignty over that which is his. All of which is bound to madden any bunch of pinkos anywhere. Good luck, Turner. End quote. While some people hoped CNN would succeed, the networks didn't just expect Ted would fail. They wanted him to. Still, when Ted spoke to a room full of advertisers before CNN's launch, he left no doubt. CNN wasn't just going to succeed. It was only the beginning of his plans to reinvent how the world got its news. Quote, I'm going now for the history books. I'm swinging for the fences, end quote. And Ted wasn't naive. He knew June 1st, 1980 was not the finish line. It was the starting point, because the real work began that Sunday night at 6 o'clock, and it ended when the world ended. If getting on the air was a battle, then staying on the air was the real war. But first, he had to launch Cable News Network. I'm Web Barr, and this is Media Moguls, the Ted Turner Saga, CNN. Hour 1, Day 1, Year 1, Decade 1. This episode is all about the launch of CNN, its first hour, first day, first year, and first decade. It's a long episode, but it's a great one, full of stories and lessons, where you realize just because you built a network doesn't mean it's gonna fly. Or does it?
When the legend becomes fact, print the legend.
What we're doing right here on this spot
is the greatest advance in television since television was invented.
They're risk takers, rule breakers, and empire builders. These are the stories of the visionaries who transform media forever.
Whatever I have is being put at risk on this project, and if it's not successful, I'll be looking for a job.
Going to Bernard Shaw.
Tear down this wall.
From High Bar, this is Media Moguls.
We won't be signing off until the world ends. We'll be on. We will cover it live.
In 1980, Ted Turner proclaimed, quote, "I can do more today in communications than any conqueror ever could have done. I want to be the hero of my country. I want to get it back to the principles that made us good. Television has led us in the last 25 years down the path of destruction. I intend to turn it around before it is too late. And the hour is late," end quote. At the end of the last episode, I mentioned how in just 11 months, CNN went from this spark of an idea to a real TV network. But that journey was a cascade of disasters. There was the lost satellite, RCA's uninspired response, the NAACP nearly blocking Ted's sale of the TV station in Charlotte, which was needed to fund CNN. In addition, they miscounted how many employees they'd actually need. And how could I forget, just a few weeks before launching, they realized that they had underestimated how many homes CNN would actually be in at launch, which forced Ted to cut his ad rates and then offer make goods to advertisers. It was truly one problem after another, and a few of these issues were actually existential. Then there was the matter of launching the very first 24/7 news network on a Sunday. Reese Schonfeld, who was CNN's co-founder and first president, put it like this, quote, "You'd have to be an idiot to open a ski resort on June 1st. Then added, "When I picked June 1, I hadn't realized it was a Sunday. Since no news happens on Sunday, we hadn't produced any shows for Sunday daytime. We would look empty. So I had changed the starting time. We would go on the air at 6 p.m. Ted loved it. It made for a better party," end quote. So, on one hand, the deck was stacked against them already, and on the other, they figured they might as well enjoy the party, right? By the time launch day came around, it had been 1 year, 22 days, and 7 hours since Reese got the call from Ted that CNN was a go. And somehow in all of that time, no one thought to ask, "Hey, what day of the week is June 1st? On one level, it's focus, baby. But on another, it's still a Sunday. Easily the slowest news day of the week and worst day of the week to make a splash, right? Panicked, Reese suggested to Ted they push CNN's debut to dinner time. Not only was it better to launch with fewer hours to fill, but it was a better time to throw a party. Ted, of course, approved. So here they were, right on the precipice of history, about to launch the first 24/7 news network ever. Ted had the final say. It was all his money on the line, right? At this point, he'd already put in $34 million and expected to lose another $2 million each month for as long as it took cable homes to come online and advertisers to buy into his news revolution. And the hardest thing for me to wrap my head around is just how much personal risk he was taking on. He was not doing this with other people's money. It was just a staggering amount of risk, all in the pursuit of greatness and a shot at history. And honestly, it's the kind of bold, all-in gamble you just don't see in today's venture capital or private equity financed worlds. Ahead of CNN's launch, Ted told Broadcasting Magazine, quote, "It doesn't bother me that I'm committing almost all I have. Had I known I was going to fail when I started, I would still have done it because it needs to be done. Of course, I also think we'll make a fortune," end quote. Or as Ted would say, "all strong." The afternoon of June 1st, 1980, felt like a party, even though workers were still racing to put the finishing touches on CNN's headquarters. That included painting the old Progressive Club, also known as Techwood, or as some called it, Ted's Terra on Techwood, named from Gone with the Wind, one of his favorite movies. Out on the lawn of this classic Southern building, Ted and 700 invited guests gathered to mark the occasion. The atmosphere that Sunday afternoon was laid back. Honestly, it probably felt more like a Southern wedding than the launch of a global news network. Still, plenty of people were there to celebrate, and just as many were there to cover it, with nearly half of the crowd made up of journalists reporting on the launch. We actually spoke with John Huey for You Had to Be There. We did an episode on CNN's launch. Huey ended up later running Time Inc. as their editor-in-chief, and he explained how it was a jovial day, but most people didn't realize how invested Ted really was.
Anyway, he just had huge risk. I think he probably had less money. The stories I have heard since then from various people inside the company, I would guess that he actually had less money than we knew, and that he was, I think he had trouble. I think he had I know of some stories where he had some desperate times at just making payroll, but he just had like most great entrepreneurs at some point in their arc of their building their business up to the breakthrough point, he just was willing to live with empty pockets, and he always drove cheap cars. He ate. He did not live a high life for a long time, and he had a vision, and he had the risk. He was willing to take the risk. I think, unfortunately, somewhere along the way, he took too many risks, and it interfered with his sovereignty to keep doing what he wanted to do. But he ended up having a pretty nice life anyway, billions of dollars and the largest landowner in the country for a long time. But he saw something and he made it happen, and it changed all of our lives, and it may have freed some countries and just changed the way we know what's going on in the world.
Still, some of the big names in attendance included NFL Commissioner Pete Rozelle, Dr. Joyce Brothers, along with congressmen, TV executives, diplomats, advertisers, and of course Ted's family, who weren't seeing much of him those days. And while the mood outside CNN's Techwood headquarters that Sunday afternoon was laid back, inside CNN's newsroom was tense and full of unpredictable, chaotic energy, which makes a lot of sense. They're doing something for the first time. It's worth adding CNN was going to be broadcasting from the basement of the same building where TBS's studio was, just one floor above. Their studio famously hosted professional wrestling matches with legends like the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes, and the Nature Boy Ric Flair. That was a wild contrast. Calm outside, chaotic, frenzied inside, with the newsroom in full-blown launch mode. Ted got there early that afternoon and came in swinging, shaking hands with everyone, talking nonstop to anyone, while bouncing between the hectic newsroom and party outside. CNN President Reese Schonfeld was doing the same. He later said, quote, "You've seen those Kentucky Derby pictures where the women are walking around with big hats, men in seersuckered suits, and the mint juleps are flowing? That was the scene." Then he added, "Ted knows how to spend money the right way, but Burt Reinhardt, who was the head ops guy, must have been flipping out. He'd been trying to save every nickel, and here's this lavish party going on. There were 300 guests, 2 huge tents, and the fountain in front of the former Progressive Club had been reinvigorated, spouting water 10 feet high," end quote. It's interesting. He said that it was half of the audience that I've read. My assumption is the other 350 were the journalists there to cover it. So take it with a grain of salt. But if you want a sign of just how chaotic things were before the June 1st launch, think about this. No one thought to set up monitors outside so the guests could actually watch CNN go live. The very thing they were there to celebrate, they couldn't even see. So once the go-ahead was given, they just had to assume it all worked out. In the meantime, they drank, mingled, and socialized. Reese put it best, quote, "To those invited, it may have seemed like a garden party, but I knew that from this day forth, presidents and kings, prime ministers and foreign ministers, the Pentagon, Congress, the media, the public, would have to adjust to CNN," end quote. By 5:40 p.m., just 20 minutes before launch, the rows of white lawn chairs were full of guests facing Ted's Techwood studio porch, where Ted was about to deliver his opening remarks. For viewers at home, since CNN was still not on the air yet, they had 20 more minutes, they could watch Ted's speech live on the Superstation. But at 6 p.m. sharp, TBS would cut to professional wrestling. So if you were one of the lucky 1.7 million homes with access to CNN, you had to change the channel to CNN because history was about to be made. Standing on stage in a blue blazer with his trademark thick mustache, Ted gestured towards the 3 flags flying on the other side of the fountain. Ted said, "One represented the state of Georgia, headquarters of the company. The second was the United States flag, which, quote, represents our country and the way we intend to serve it with the cable news network, The third flag was the United Nations flag, which Ted said, quote, "We hope that cable news network, with its international coverage and greater death coverage, will bring both in the country and in the world a better understanding of how people from different nations live and work together, and within the nation work together, so that we can perhaps, hopefully, bring together in brotherhood and friendship, in kindness and peace, the people of this nation and this world," end quote. Then came the benediction delivered by Reverend William Borders, who said, quote, "Let us pray. We thank thee this day for Ted Turner and all those who worked with him. Continue, our Father, in our behalf. In thy name, in thy name, in thy name we pray. Amen," end quote. Just minutes before the 6 p.m. launch, Ted read a poem by Edward Kessler, which he'd slightly adapted to reflect CNN's mission. It read,
To act upon one's convictions while others wait, to create a positive force in a world where cynics abound, to provide information to people when it wasn't available before, to offer those who want it a choice, for the American people whose thirst for understanding and a better life has made this venture possible, for the cable industry whose pioneering spirit caused this great step forward in communications, and for those employees of Turner Broadcasting whose total commitment to their company has brought us together today, I dedicate the news channel for America, the cable news network.
And then when he finishes, the crowd rises and the military bands in attendance start playing the national anthem. It's pretty awesome and inspiring, right? While all of that is happening, Ted's speech, the music, the pomp and circumstance of it all, down in CNN's basement newsroom, the staff was getting ready to go live and change the world. Now, whether you were an executive, an anchor, or a VJ, you were given a 51-page manual called Inside CNN, and it explained everything. Inside it was CNN's mission, and their mission was very simple, and I think it was pretty powerful. The mission read, quote, "Make our newscasts so good that people across the country will think of us when they think of television news," end quote. And personally, I think that's pretty freaking great. For a news network that planned to be on the air 24/7, or as Ted said, till the end of the world, to focus on quality first and make their news so good that they'd become synonymous with the news, well, that's really bold. I mean, I'm fired up just thinking about it. But in the newsroom studio, where they were about to go live to the world, or at least to bring the world to 1.7 million cable households across the country, they weren't thinking about being bold or their legacy. No, they were thinking about, what are we going to say when that green light comes on? And how to make it out of that first hour unscathed. That's right, they didn't know what they were going to say when that green light went on because they were so busy building the network that they never thought about it. So, once the bands finished playing the national anthem, the 11 months of total chaos and madness leading up to this moment were behind them. And then, right after the final note, Ted shouted his trademark, "All right." CNN was now officially on the air. And then Ted added, quote, "At least I think we're on the air. At least I hope so," end quote. Remember, there's no monitors for people outside to see CNN on the air. He has no idea if they're actually live. And with that, an opening video played debuting CNN to the world, or at least the 1.7 million homes that could actually receive it. And as the video played, the camera zoomed in on CNN's first-of-its-kind satellite farm, at Techwood, as viewers heard voiceover listing the cities those dishes might bring news from. Quote,
Saga, Birmingham, New York, US, Naples, Rome, Los Angeles, Niagara Falls, Paris, Tulsa, Denver, London, Canton, Newark, Peking, Orleans, San Diego, Reno, Nicaragua, San Francisco, Seoul, Perth, the Marianne, the United Nations, Vienna, Buffalo, Lima, Kiribati, Islamabad, Decatur, Nashville, Jamaica, Jonestown, Chicago, Weatherford, Topeka, Tokyo, Madison, Fort Worth, Fort Wayne, Warsaw, Bangor.
Ready, camera one, box. Take 11, Mike Q. To New York. Stand by, ready, 3, take 3, Mike Q. 3, start to slow zoom in a little bit. Roll tape, take 3. Ready, 13.
Inside headquarters, director Guy Pepper reminded his crew, quote, "Don't forget, in television, shit flows downhill." Then he said, "Ready, camera 3, 1 center up," end quote. Now, here's something most people don't think about before a groundbreaking moment like this. What do you actually say on the air to launch something like CNN? I mean, we all know what CNN became. You know, it's a global institution. Yes, even today, the brand still transcends all borders. But even back in 1980, you'd assume someone would have thought through the very first words that would be said on the air, right? Kind of like Neil Armstrong thinking about what he'd say when he landed on the moon. Surely they would have written a script, debated it, argued over the phrasing, then rewrote it, wordsmithed it, voted, vetoed. You know the drill. These days, if something this big were launching, not only would all of that happen, I'm sure it would have been market tested to death by overpriced consultants, both internally and externally. But on June 1st, 1980, just minutes before 6 p.m., they had no idea what they were going to say when the on-air lights started flashing. Literally no idea. So as co-anchors Lois Hart and Dave Walker waited for their cue to go live, they suddenly realized that no one had told them how to actually introduce the network and begin the broadcast. Keep in mind, this is a historical make-or-break moment, more likely a break moment at this point. Anchor Lois Hart remembered what it was like in those final seconds. Quote, "There were these three guys standing a yard away from the anchor desk screaming at each other. What are we supposed to say to start this damn thing? One wanted some lofty introduction to the world's greatest journalistic operation. You know, welcome to the new world, blah, blah, blah. And some executive producer was fighting with Kavanaugh. They both wanted us to say something different. Dave and I were still sitting there wondering what the hell was going to happen here." End quote. All of this happened as a drum roll blasted as loud as possible through the studio speakers. And as that introduction video played to the outside world, a graphic then appeared on screen saying CNN, the news channel. And then somewhere, either out of necessity or just being a real professional, Dave Walker looked directly into the camera and said,
Good evening, I'm David Walker.
And I'm Lois Hart. Now here's the news. President Carter has arrived in Fort Wayne, Indiana.
I love the, now here's the news. That's simple, and that's what they're doing. They're just bringing the news. Later, Dave Walker said that he made the decision with Lois on their own, opening with good evening and closing their 2-hour cycle with,
Stay with us. We're going to have all kinds of news, sports, weather, and special features coming from now on and forever. For Dave Walker, I'm Lois Hart. The news channel now continues.
Now that's pretty damn strong. It's also a testament to professionalism, improvisation, but more than anything, to people. Because we tend to forget in today's super optimized world that people make these things happen. Ted Turner's news revolution had officially begun, and it wouldn't stop until the end of the world, something Ted literally promised. And if that day ever came, Ted had a plan. A tape of the Army, Navy, and Marine bands playing Nearer My God to Thee would air on CNN. Now, Nearer My God to Thee is the same song that plays while the Titanic goes down. In the movie Titanic, it's the one that the three-person, all the violinists are playing. It's a beautiful song, but yeah, I mean, you don't want like the Titanic song playing when CNN goes down. But as Ted put it, and he said this a number of times, so I'm just paraphrasing this, in the event the end of the world comes, then we'll cover the story and sign off playing Nearer My God to Thee. And the thing is, Ted wasn't joking. He was dead serious. He even sent a copy of the song to a bomb-proof underground shelter in the Tennessee hills, where it would be preserved forever, just in case. CNN's Sunday night launch went off without a hitch, and the rest of their carefully planned opening night, designed to showcase their unique style of covering the news, or as Reese called it, randomonium, along with their new technical capabilities, was ready to unfold. Unfold. Now that's an important word, because unlike the networks, which carefully packaged 30 minutes of news for the masses each night, CNN would let the news unfold, meaning it would play out in real time. And on their very first evening, instead of simply jumping from anchor to anchor, recapping the news from the day's earlier events, CNN got their first breaking story and their first live cutaway. That breaking news was President Jimmy Carter's visit to the bedside of civil rights leader Vernon Jordan, who had been shot a few days before in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Reese later said, quote, "God sent us that story," end quote. It started with Dave Walker reading news from state and federal investigations, then Lois Hart getting reactions to the shooting from locals. Then CNN made history with their first live cutaway to Vernon Jordan's hospital room, where President Carter held a press conference. Now, by today's standards, this probably seems pretty bland, but at the time, It was groundbreaking. The networks rarely, if ever, had time for this kind of live coverage. Instead, they'd maybe show a brief edited clip from the presser. But here was CNN cutting live to the president as he spoke. Reese said, quote, "That's what going live is all about," end quote. Randy Harbour, a CNN copy editor working that day, later said, quote, "By the end of that first hour, I knew the answer to the question of whether CNN would survive. When Carter came out of Jordan's room and stepped up to the waiting microphones, CNN was live. The three broadcast networks would air portions of Carter's remarks later on their 30-minute evening newscasts, but CNN was live as it happened. As I listened to Carter speak, I thought to myself, you know, this is going to work," end quote. From Fort Wayne, CNN took viewers on a global news tour using their groundbreaking backhaul satellite system, which I explained in the last episode. Remember, it was invisible to viewers, but allowed CNN to instantly connect and broadcast from bureaus around the world. So basically, they have satellites for just CNN to communicate with each other. Live reports started in Jerusalem, then moved to Los Angeles for an update on the California primary. Then they switched to New York, where they covered an altercation at a bar involving New York Yankees superstar Mr. October, Reggie Jackson. And finally, they went to Mike Botcher in Key West, reporting from a dock on the ongoing Cuban refugee crisis, which, if you've ever seen Brian De Palma's Scarface, you know something about. Reese Schonfeld said that God smiled on CNN on opening night, pointing to the flood of major, fast-breaking stories that poured in almost as soon as they went live. He wanted stories CNN could own, stories that were too big and too fast-moving for the network's short evening broadcasts, and he got them on day one. As CNN's first night unfolded, the team quickly realized there wasn't just enough news to fill the time, there was too much. Remember, in the last episode, I mentioned how the networks couldn't wrap their heads around the idea of 24/7 news, and how they thought there wouldn't be enough news to fill the time. Well, it took just a few hours for CNN to prove all their assumptions wrong. There was more news than they could keep up with. In fact, they had so much news on night one that they were struggling to find the time to run all their committed commercials. Now, news people and creatives in general tend to avoid and even look down on the business side of things. They always have. And I really wish they didn't, but they probably always will. For decades, newspapers, magazines, and network news departments have kept editorial totally separate from advertising and marketing, all to make sure advertisers couldn't influence their reporting. It's called separation of church and state. I'm sure you've heard of it. If you haven't, you're probably thinking, what in the world? Why would someone not want to understand the business of the industry they work in? It's a great question. And in the 7.5 years I worked at National Geographic magazine, I can count the number of meetings I had with the advertising department on one hand. It's just one of those weird, outdated things that make no sense in 2025. I mean, you'd think you'd want editors, reporters, and newsroom leaders to understand how the business side worked, right? Well, not so much. But we're not talking about 2025, we're talking about 1980. And back then, that's exactly how it worked. And obviously, I'm skipping over a lot of nuance. So, while CNN's editorial team focused on covering the news, business interests were still there, just in the background. But anytime a journalist had the ability to stick it to the advertisers, show them that news came first, well, I guess they felt like that's what they should do. It's a win for the good guys over the man, I guess, Business interests be damned. I think it's, I don't know. I've always thought the whole church and state thing is both outdated and kind of bizarre. I know it makes sense in theory, especially back then, but today in practice, not always. And I think that's a big theme of this story. Theory does not always equal reality, right? Similarly, you could have separation of church and state, and then you look 10, 15 years beyond, and the people who are on the business side only understand business. They don't understand storytelling and news. And the people on the news side don't understand economics. They don't understand how the money is made, and you have a problem. Anyways, just 20 minutes into CNN's first night on air, their very first commercial aired. Fittingly, or maybe ironically, I'm not really sure which, the ad was for Maalox Plus Antacid.
More when the news channel continues.
There are many medications for acid indigestion or heartburn relief. Which one is right for you? For years, Maalox has been recommended most by doctors. Now, the antacid ingredients in here, plus an extra ingredient, are in Maalox Plus tablets. Really pleasant tasting and effective. And Maalox Plus tablets also come in this handy pocket pack that keeps them fresh and sanitary. Maalox Plus for acid indigestion or heartburn relief. But don't just take my word for it. Try Maalox Plus tablets. You'll find you can't do better.
Immediately after the Maalox ad, They cut away from the next commercial to go live to a press conference with the president. It was the one we talked about earlier. Now, I've talked about how rare these live unedited press conferences were in the era of packaged network news, but to cut away from a commercial, which was making them money, to go live to the president, well, that was groundbreaking. So groundbreaking, in fact, that Reese immediately turned to Ted and asked, quote, "How do you like the way we cut away from our first commercial to go to Carter? It couldn't have been better if God had written it," end quote. Ted's response, quote, "That'll show them. That'll show them we'll never bow down to the advertisers. You can always run ads later. Who cares about ads anyhow? It's a news operation," end quote. Reese later added, quote, "It was an easy decision. I knew we had plenty of unsold commercial inventory and could make good on that commercial in another show. It didn't cost us a cent," end quote. Killing the commercial wasn't just a news judgment call. It was a moment of pride, not only for Reese, but also for Ted Kavanaugh, Dan Shore, and of course, Ted Turner, because it proved their focus was real, and that focus was covering the news. So how many people actually tuned in to CNN on June 1st, 1980? Well, while CNN was available in 1.7 million cable households at launch, that's just the number of homes they could access, not actual viewership. The truth is, we don't know exactly how many people watched that night. Nielsen didn't rate CNN yet, and those early numbers only showed potential reach, not how many TVs were actually tuned into CNN. Realistically, a much smaller number of people probably watched CNN that first night, but we'll never know the actual viewership numbers since Nielsen didn't rate CNN at this point. In Atlanta, where interest was highest, I've seen estimates that fewer than 12,000 cable subscribers were able to see CNN, but that's likely a symptom of limited cable carriage, not interest. Remember, Ted's a celebrity in Atlanta. Now, at the end of the last episode, I mentioned that Ted and his team overprojected CNN's initial viewership. What this meant was that it was going to take a lot more time for the audience and cable systems to catch up to his vision. You see, Ted needed more cable systems to pick up CNN, or he'd be in serious trouble within a year or so. But his hope was to break even sometime in CNN's first 12 to 18 months. Still, it's not like Ted was delusional or thought growing CNN's revenue was going to be easy. After Panorama, which was a publication at the time, reported his audience projection shortfall, Ted admitted to their reporter he was scared. And to emphasize just how big of a challenge it was, Panorama added, quote, "The boss may be a rich man in his circles, but the $100 million Turner says he has to lose on CNN is less than 1/6 of what the Washington Post company took in last year. And there are several other even bigger vultures circling in the sky. No wonder Ted Turner is nervous," end quote. But for now, after CNN's first night on the air, all that mattered to Ted Turner was that they got on the air. And as CNN's first night wrapped up, Ted told folks, quote, "I'm so happy I could die." Then added, "Nobody believed we could do it, but there it is," end quote. Years later, looking back on that moment and what they'd built, Reese Schonfeld reminisced, quote, "Nobody believed him, did they? With anybody else, you would say that kind of talk is ridiculous. But Ted will find a way to do it. He was already discussing with me the possibility of getting a feed from Russian television in 1981. I told him I doubted their government would permit it, but who was going to tell Ted it was impossible?" End quote. You know, when you have leaders that know how to make people do better work or work they never knew they could do, that's another unlock. There's this great new book called Apple in China, and it goes over the manufacturing and supply chains of Apple in China, obviously. And there's a story about the iMac, Steve Jobs' first product after coming back to Apple in 1997. And they're developing the iMac, and it just can't be built. And everyone, including their engineers and their product designers, are all saying it cannot be done. We cannot make this Bondi blue iMac. And he said, "I don't care. We're going to do it. Or I'm going to go find other people that will do it." And people quit. But in the end, they figured out a way to do it. You need someone who's not going to stop. A person that's not going to rest on their laurels, but also like pushes you. We all need that. So they'd done it. And beyond how Ted and Reese felt about the launch, here's a quick smattering, fun word, right, of the initial reviews for the cable news network. Jonathan Miller of the Washington Post wrote, quote, "Goodbye, Walter Cronkite. Hello, Ted," end quote. And since Washington, D.C. wasn't wired yet for cable, legendary TV critic Tom Shales had to cross the Potomac in search of cable, and he wrote, "It was, quote, obvious from the premiere that CNN means business, and that it is anything but the plaything of a playboy. A new day dawned at dusk," end quote. Now, Dick Williams of the Atlanta Constitution offered a more pragmatic view. Quote, "The question, will Turner pull it off, has been replaced by, how long do you think it will last?" End quote. Now that CNN was on the air, the network's old out-of-sight, out-of-mind approach of airing just 30 minutes of news each day suddenly felt very outdated. Once viewers experienced CNN, they quickly realized just how much more was actually happening in the world. And lucky for CNN, the summer of 1980 was packed with major events that provided the perfect showcase for their global news coverage. While CBS might offer 30 seconds here or a minute of coverage there, CNN ran stories live in real time as they unfolded, and it was revolutionary. So let's break down some of the big headlines from the summer of 1980. We've got the death of the Shah of Iran, both the Democrat and Republican national conventions, the eruption of Mount St. Helens, and much, much more. And while CNN was still getting its sea legs in the summer of 1980, Ted was embarking on what would be his last season of professional sailing. After finishing third as captain of the Courageous in America's Cup, Ted didn't blame his skills. No, he blamed his lack of focus. This from a guy who once said, quote, "Sailing is like screwing. You can never get enough," end quote. Well, Ted Turner had had enough. He decided then and there to hang up the mast and call it a day on his sailing career. It was time to focus on much bigger things on land, and it was time to really compete in the global media arena. So once he was back in Atlanta, Ted practically lived in his office, where he matched the newsroom's pace and pushed everyone in his orbit to their limits. Now, some of my favorite stories from this time come from reporters who worked long hours in the newsroom, like Nick Charles, one of CNN's first hires as their sports reporter. Nick told the story of how he'd get to work early in the morning and see Ted wrapped in a towel or bathrobe coming out of his office, where he often slept on the Murphy bed, to get coffee in the newsroom. No big deal. He remembered Ted puffing on a cigar early one morning telling him, quote, "Don't worry about ratings, just do it." Then Charles added, he was much more than a cheerleader. He was a guy you wanted to run through the wall for, end quote. Another account of Ted leaving his office in the middle of the night to get coffee was told as, quote, "You'd be sitting there in the middle of the night trying to put together a weather map. You'd look up, and there would be Ted Turner standing right in front of you in his bare feet. Nothing on but a rumpled old bathrobe," end quote. News anchor Dave Walker, the one who opened up CNN on their first day, remembered, quote, "He would generally come down and get 2 cups of coffee. He had a shower and everything up in his office. And in those early days, you'd see him running around in that bathrobe saying, 'Hi, how are all y'all?' He was a sight, chewing tobacco all the time, spitting in that little Dixie cup he carried around, and juggling those 2 cups of coffee back upstairs," end quote. That's Ted Turner, guys. Folk hero stuff, right? Now, at the beginning of this episode, I mentioned how CNN President Reese Schonfeld said, quote, "You'd have to be an idiot to open a ski resort on June 1st. Well, in that statement, he also said this, quote, "Likewise, you'd also have to be an idiot to launch a 24-hour news network in a quadrennial year," end quote. Now, a quadrennial year is newsroom shorthand for a presidential election year, and these years are very expensive. You've got primaries, conventions, campaign stops all over the country, and the election itself, with all of its complexity, and all of that amounts to a lot of money. To cover an election the right way, you need serious preparation and organization. The networks had huge teams of producers and researchers who spent the full 4 years between elections just getting ready for the next one. And they'd already done it many times before. And CNN? Not so much. Reese admitted, quote, 6 weeks before the Republican convention, 10 weeks before the Democratic convention, we had no election unit, no designated political correspondent, no designated researchers. Even while we were completing construction on our own bureaus, we had to begin construction on convention booths. Even while we were finishing the construction of the lines and satellite links between our bureaus and headquarters, we had to begin arranging for lines and links from Detroit and New York, the convention cities, to Atlanta. It was an absurdity, end quote. In its first summer, CNN was gaining momentum fast, thanks to a torrent of big news stories. They adapted an us against the world type of attitude, where they were determined to push their coverage to the max, to the limit, even though they were still a startup, with tight budgets and limited resources, and knowing that fighting the networks on their terms wasn't smart. So what did Reese Schonfeld and all of his infinite wisdom decide to do? Take the network's election coverage heads on, of course. Honestly, this was an insane decision. And for once, it was the wrong one. So instead of covering the election in a focused, simple, and strategic manner, Reese wanted to prove that CNN, or maybe that he, could actually go toe-to-toe with the big three networks in something they live for: election season, their Super Bowl. For decades, election season, which went from the party conventions to election night, so that's basically mid-July until November, was a ratings battleground, a nonstop war where each network pulled out all the stops. And whoever won the ratings on election night, well, they often led the ratings race for the next 4 years. It was a chance for each of the networks to show their stuff and prove to potential and existing viewers that they were the best in the game. But despite knowing how hard it would be, Reese pushed CNN to cover the full cycle, 2 conventions, 2 campaigns, and a massive election evening, just to compete head-to-head with the big three networks. CNN is basically just 2 months old when this is all going down. It's pretty crazy. Now, remember, before running CNN, Reese Schonfeld had never actually produced any live news coverage himself. And this is one of those times where that lack of experience probably showed up. It's like a land war in Asia. No one wins. And Reese should have known better. In his memoir, Reese reflected on CNN's 1980 campaign coverage, quote, "If CNN wanted to cover the 1980 campaign, it should have had crews in Tehran, in Washington, and wherever else the secret negotiations were going on. The last place we needed them was on the campaign trail," end quote. I agree. He's right. That's exactly what they should have done, but they didn't. Fortunately, it didn't hurt the network. But with such limited resources, going head-to-head with the big three networks made no sense. And maybe that's part of the reason why Reese wouldn't last long at CNN. Still, when it came to election night itself, he admitted, quote, "We weren't ready for network-style election night coverage. But the polls had given us an easy out. I didn't take advantage of it. On Monday night, CNN should have said, Reagan is the winner. Senate and House races are still in doubt. We'll keep our eye on them for you. But for local results, best to watch your local station," end quote. Now, hindsight is obviously 2020, but what they should have done was what Ted was best at: counter-programming. You know, stick with regular news while the networks went wall-to-wall on their election coverage. Focus on your strengths, not your weaknesses. Reese later said they should have followed CNN's core principle: don't try to beat the other guy at his own game. But he added, quote, "Ambition had overridden reason. We were reckless. The Washington Bureau and the New York Bureau thought we could report the election in depth, much as the networks did. We set up a special election desk in addition to the main news desk. The news desk would handle news stories. The election desk would handle results. You can't be a little bit pregnant. We had only been on the air for 5 months. Only a half dozen of our people had ever covered a national election, and we were unable to spend the kind of money the networks spent. We lagged far behind the networks nationally and state by state. They would declare winners. We didn't even have starting times. The 2-desk system didn't work either. It was sloppy," end quote. Now, the good news from CNN's 1980 election coverage was that it didn't hurt the network, but it did reveal deeper issues. Things like arrogance, personal grudges, and budget mismanagement that would keep showing up. And while few noticed these problems at the time, it was clear that if CNN wanted to take on the networks, it still had a lot to learn. Reese summed it up, quote, "We lost, but nobody was looking," end quote. And while that was mostly true, very few were actually looking, except for the one person who mattered most. He was watching. That was Ted Turner. By the time Americans went to vote in 1980 for the presidential election, inflation had hit 12.6%, and unemployment was over 7%. The economy was struggling. And we all know how that ended, right? With Ronald Reagan defeating President Jimmy Carter by more than 8 million popular votes and winning 44 of 50 states in the Electoral College. It was an incredible mandate for change from the American people. Not only that, for the first time in over 25 years, Republicans were able to take control of the Senate. It was a political landslide and a major vibe shift in America. And while I'm not going to dive too deep into politics this episode, I think it's important to highlight just how bad the economy was at this point in 1980, because that's the market CNN was launching into. For me, it's wild to see numbers like 12.6% inflation, 7% unemployment. That's like the financial crisis, basically, which are way worse than we see today. Back then, CNN was launching into one of the worst economies in recent memory. And yet, despite that, cable was booming. So, what would happen if this economy started growing when interest rates were lower and money was easier to borrow? We'll see soon enough. A few weeks after CNN's overextended election coverage fizzled out, one of Reese's early promises about how CNN would cover the news finally came true. In the last episode, we talked about how over lunch with the New York Times editors back in 1979, Reese told them CNN would cover breaking news as it happened, as it unfolded, and not just recap it later like the networks did. The editors were skeptical. They said, wouldn't that be like rushing to cover a fire without knowing if it was a real blaze or just a false alarm? Right? Remember that? Well, Reese's prophecy came true on November 21st, 1980, when a massive fire broke out at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas. While the networks probably would have covered the fire in a 30-second segment on the nightly news, CNN jumped right in and covered it as it unfolded, live in real time as the fire raged. And unlike their 1980 election coverage, this was exactly the type of story CNN was built for. This was their edge. Now, when the fire first broke out, Reese was at a conference. But later he said it was the only time Ted ever called him to ask about a story, asking, "Are we going to have the fire?" Reese said yes, but admitted if he didn't have the fire, then he'd be fired. So fortunately, they had it. CNN picked up the live feed from the CBS affiliate in Las Vegas, which was part of the deal Reese made with their affiliate before CNN even launched. I discussed that in the last episode as well. And while CBS ran 5 minutes of it on their national news broadcast, the rest of the footage went to CNN. Now, this was exactly why CNN existed, and at the same time, it showed just how valuable all of those affiliate relationships Reese had built really were. This was CNN playing to its strengths, doing what it did best, not trying to outdo the networks on expensive, expansive coverage, but doing things the networks wouldn't do. This is how startups win, guys. Not by copying the incumbents or the giants of the world, but by doing things differently. And as the fire grew, so did the story's importance and reach. TV stations from around the world started calling for CNN's footage, especially in Japan, where a number of their citizens were staying at the MGM Grand. They wanted the news too. So, CNN stayed on the story nonstop, even when helicopters circled the MGM Grand roof as crews tried to evacuate guests. The coverage just kept going, in a way no one had ever really seen before. It's awesome. Now, one of my favorite stories came on the second day of coverage when Jim Miklashevsky interviewed firefighters and brought up the long-standing and still prevalent rumor that Las Vegas casinos pumped oxygen to keep gamblers awake. And while officials denied it, Mick asked a firefighter if that could have been a factor. The firefighter said, quote, "The fire was so hot and furious, it was such a fireball that raced through the casino that he suspected it was fed by an accelerant like oxygen." End quote. Amazing. Gotta love the Vegas. It wasn't just the fire in those initial 6 months. Just 6 months and 8 days after CNN launched, another major tragic story hit, which was the assassination of John Lennon on December 8th, 1980. And CNN's coverage of it completely changed how a story like this could be told. In the past, the networks might break the news, similar to how Howard Cosell famously did during Monday Night Football with Lennon's death, then follow it up with a short video package on the nightly news.
John Smith is on the line, and I don't care what's on the line, Howard. You have got to say what we know in the booth.
Yes, we have to say it. Remember, this is just a football game, no matter who wins or loses. An unspeakable tragedy confirmed to us by ABC News in New York City. John Lennon, outside of his apartment building on the west side of New York City, the most famous perhaps of all of the Beatles, shot twice in the back rushed to Roosevelt Hospital, dead on arrival. Hard to go back to the game after that news flash, which in duty bound we had to take. Frank?
Indeed it is.
You see, there wasn't rolling live coverage of someone of John Lennon's importance or stature, who wasn't at least a politician, but was still one of the most famous people in the world and truly beloved and a peacemaker and all that stuff. The networks just didn't do that kind of thing, rolling coverage when someone passed away. You know, scarcity and airtime, and got to maximize those ad dollars, right? But CNN could, and they did. CNN went live from outside the Dakota, which was John Lennon's apartment building by Central Park, and sent Strawberry Fields to the world.
There are flowers against the gate. People are chanting, singing. Candles are lit. It is raining. Many are here to mourn John Lennon.
Under a sea of umbrellas, many came to stare and to reflect. John Lennon had written songs they had protested with, loved with, and grew up with. Neither the rain nor the chill could keep them away.
I don't know where else to go. I feel sort of guilty if I just need to be here. I don't know how to explain.
What did John Lennon mean to you? Why are you standing out here in the rain when it's very cold with a group of people?
He told people to question what's happening to him and think and do what they feel.
John, in his life, has given more love than most men and women on the face of this earth. We're here to prove that love is not dead, even though John is.
I feel very sorry that he had to die here. It is still the greatest city in the world. But even though he's dead, his spirit still lives on. And his spirit lives in us and all the people that lived here.
Many here say they will be here all night. One man from Florida said he came here this afternoon to pay tribute to John Lennon because he's an institution. There was no other place he could go to express his feelings. Joanne Lee, Cable News Network, in front of the Dakota in New York City.
It was a horrible tragedy, one that I think many people are still recovering from. But CNN's coverage didn't make it any less groundbreaking. And while 1980 ended on such a somber note, for CNN, 1980 was a success. So let's break down some numbers. When CNN launched in June 1980, they had just 7 national advertisers. The average advertising rate was $102 for a 30-second spot. Now, $102 per spot is cheap, but within 6 months of being on the air, CNN had already pulled in $3.9 million in revenue. Not a bad start for Team Tenacity, right? By the end of 1980, CNN was available in 4.3 million homes and projected to hit 8 million subscribers by the end of 81, which meant a potential for $16 million in revenue. At the time, around 18 million homes in America had cable, which sounds like a lot, but it was still less than 40% of the country, so tons of room for growth. Still, CNN needed around $25 million a year just to operate, and at the start of 1981, Ted was losing around $2 million a month, which I've discussed, but he could potentially break even by the end of the year if literally everything went according to plan. But in our story, things don't ever go according to plan, right? Not in Ted Turner's volatile media world, do they? And by that I mean things would be fine as long as no serious competitors showed up. Now, as 1980 turned to 1981, money wasn't exactly growing on trees at Turner Broadcasting, and rumors were flying that Ted was in serious financial trouble. CNN's expenses were climbing, and the whole company, including TBS, had to tighten up. Remember, CNN's startup costs were in the tens of millions, and it was costing Ted $2 million a month to run the network. On top of that, he had borrowed over $27 million to get CNN off the ground, so tightening up made a lot of sense. And when Turner Broadcasting's Vice President of Finance, Bill Bevins, had to publicly deny rumors that CNN was paying its staff with money from Braves concession stands, well, something must have been off. Because let's be real, when your finance guy has to come out and reassure everyone that crazy rumors like that are not true, well, usually it's a sign of some kind of trouble. Like, where there's smoke, normally there's some fire, right? And then there's the bumper sticker stunt, when Ted Turner went on TBS to sell bumper stickers for $5 each that said, "I support CNN." It raised some eyebrows. Some even wondered if CNN was in trouble. Like, why is Ted Turner on television trying to sell bumper stickers for $5 a piece? It doesn't look good. Ted was clearly frustrated at how slowly some things were moving at CNN, and just like he'd done with his begathon at the Charlotte station in the early 70s, Ted couldn't resist going on air himself to raise some money. Of course, the bumper sticker campaign did not catch on, but it sparked his next idea, which was preempting regular programming on WTBS for a full day to give viewers a 24-hour taste of CNN's nonstop news. He thought that viewers would watch it on TBS and call their cable operator and say, I want CNN, similar to the I Want My MTV campaign, but before that. And while it didn't bring a flood of new subscribers he'd hoped for, it did help CNN grow, slowly but steadily, and with the economy beginning to pick up, along with more cable operators adding CNN to their programming lineups, well, things were looking better. By late 1980, early 1981, the superstation was generating enough cash to cover CNN's operating costs, and yet, Ted surprisingly was taking a more cautious approach. Cox Cable's Walter Peary spoke on behalf of the cable industry, telling the Atlanta Constitution, quote, I don't think Turner is in the sort of trouble some people say he is. He knew CNN was going to lose money for a while. He may have a money crunch, but it's temporary. The cable industry is exploding, and with that explosion, he'll be saved, end quote. By early 1981, Ted was everywhere, bouncing between cable conventions and advertising meetings across the country, pitching CNN as the future of television and cable. But one big hurdle was channel space. You see, older cable systems could only carry 12 channels around there. CNN had more success getting onto newer systems, which had room to grow. And in a way, it kind of echoed the same scarcity problem Ted faced with the networks and the superstation, right? On the advertising front, Ted's God-level sales abilities led to around 50 advertisers. Eventually, even Procter & Gamble bought into CNN, even when there still weren't ratings. And there was no proof that CNN was actually working. Remarkably, advertisers were putting their money on CNN because of Ted Turner. They were betting on him. That was a leap of faith. And what could their rationale have been? Well, Ted had proved everyone wrong over and over and over again, right? So why would CNN be any different? Now that CNN was on the air, that was really all the proof advertisers needed to say, okay, we're interested. Bristol-Myers Director of Media and Program Services, Robert L. Turner, said, quote, the cable viewer is different than the normal TV viewer. He watches more TV, has a larger family, and is more upscale, end quote. I'm not sure if any of that is accurate, but it sounds good, right? Still, not everyone in 1981 was convinced that cable was the future. William Tenebrusu, Senior Vice President at Kenyon and Eckhart Advertising, was unconvinced of cable's audience potential along with 90% of the country, said, quote, the onus is on CNN to produce evidence that these homes are upscale, end quote. Remarkable, right? But since Nielsen didn't rate CNN at this point, agencies had no choice but to trust Ted Turner's own version of the numbers when it came to demographics and ratings. Anyways, eventually it became clear that TBS's profits wouldn't cover CNN's losses forever, so Ted floated the idea of doing a stock offer of 1 million new shares to raise cash, which would better finance the company's operations and growth. Makes sense, right? And it caught the attention of Time Inc., who sent Jerry Levin down to gauge Ted's interest in selling CNN, or part of CNN. Now, remember, years earlier, we discussed this in the first CNN episode, Levin had been interested in launching a news service as part of HBO's cable offerings, and even produced a pilot with Reese Schonfeld, all before Ted decided to finally do CNN. Now, this meeting between Ted and Levin not only confirmed once again that Ted was building something real with CNN, but that he should also start building a war chest. So, Ted moved forward with his plans to sell $15 million to Turner Broadcasting stock, which valued the company around $200 million, and also let TBS increase its credit lines at the banks by at least $50 million. Now, I'm not an equities or debt expert, but here's the deal. Once a company plans a stock offering, the SEC doesn't allow executives like Ted to talk publicly about the business or its financials until stock registration is complete, right? This is known as the quiet period. And during this quiet period, Ted agreed to go on CNN's own talk show, which was hosted by Sandy Freeman, to talk shop. Now, right before the show, Reese Schonfeld, who was producing all of CNN, warned Freeman, quote, there are just two subjects you absolutely cannot mention: his father's suicide and the company's stock offering, end quote. And so what did Freeman do? Well, she opened the interview with exactly those two questions, back to back. The only one she was told not to ask. Unreal. Still, despite Ted's rambling answers, his lawyers and bankers decided the interview had killed any chance of moving forward with a stock offering. Now, as someone who loves a great conspiracy theory, there are some people who believe Ted set the whole thing up without telling his lawyers or bankers, because by then, Ted was worth more than $200 million valuation tied into the new stock issuance. And maybe right then and there, Ted just decided to kill it. Hey, I have the valuation, perception's reality. I don't know. Dan Schechter told Porter Bibb in his Ted Turner biography, quote, I don't know if he let Sandy in on his plan, but she was having enough trouble with Reese and probably would have done the opposite of anything he told her. Schechter thinks Turner may have had second thoughts about giving up any equity. He was now back up to 87% of the outstanding shares, regardless of the price, end quote. In the years that followed, Ted would use competitive bids for stakes in CNN to bolster the company's credit lines and valuation. I don't know how legal that is, but he did it. So while I don't know what he was thinking on Sandy Freeman's show that night, nor do I really want to guess, it's clear he made the right call to not issue more stock, which would have diluted his ownership, right? Ultimately, when Ted announced TBS's first quarter results for 1981, the company reported pre-tax losses of around $6.5 million, and any talk of a new stock offering was quietly dropped. And the fact that Ted didn't make a public statement about it, well, that stood out. Now, at this point in our episode, and really in this season, I'm trying hard not to sound like a broken record. But when I repeat myself, I gotta tell you, it's intentional. I'm calling out a pattern, something that matters, not just here, but in future episodes too. By early 1981, the big three networks still didn't take CNN very seriously. To them, they were little more than a cheap knockoff of the news coverage that they were already delivering to Americans daily. In a 1981 article in Broadcasting Magazine, CBS Vice President Gene Matter pointed out that CBS's total budget was about $30 million a year, which was less than a quarter of what CBS spent on news. Now, even with my C-level high school math skills, I can tell you that means CBS was spending around $120 million a year just on news in 1981. The network's mentality of putting down CNN by saying, and I'm going to paraphrase their thinking here, so since we spend more money on news to the tune of 4 or 5 or 6 times more each, then our news product must be better. And by the way, we care more than they do, which is pretty twisted when you think about it, because there's countless examples over the last few decades, if not longer, of well-capitalized Goliaths, incumbent giants who've been defeated by smaller, scrappier teams with much smaller budgets and resources. But what did they have? Much bigger visions. It's constraints breed creativity, while having far less friction or ties to the past models and paradigms, right? It's just a fact. Innovator's Dilemma 101. In the same article, ABC News Vice President Ab Weston said, quote, we can't broadcast everything that comes in, but much of what we don't put on, I'm not sure anyone would want to see. If you live in Kansas, do you really care about the comings and goings of ministers at a conference in Luxembourg? End quote. To which Ted replied, quote, what kind of dumb question is that? Who is that guy anyway? I want to know about a conference in Luxembourg. I don't know about people in Kansas, but I'm sure they might want to know too. And then added, makes you wonder, doesn't it? We can cover the world news 24 hours a day for a year for the same price those pinkos at the network spend to give us 30 minutes of news a day for 3 months. And they're laughing at me? End quote. You see, Ted hated this smug tone coming from the media elite. And when a reporter from Home Video magazine told him CNN lacked focus, Ted snapped. Quote, wait a minute. Wait a goddamn minute. You think it lacks focus? What is focus anyway? If you're live all the time, how can you have focus? Focus means that you know where you're going. You can't focus on something unless you know what you're focusing on. Focus is something a newspaper has because there's already a day to think about it. Or with a magazine, there's a month. Whoever said that is a yo-yo, end quote. Now, this is the kind of situation where it reminds me of Teddy Roosevelt's Man in the Arena speech, which, granted, today gets a lot of eye rolls, but trust me, as someone who is in the fucking arena, it's a real thing. Ted wasn't just in the arena, he was building a new arena. with his own money, damn it. And most of the media still didn't understand what he was really creating with CNN. It's pretty amazing, but that's kind of what happens when you're used to a certain system and norms for so long, right? You get entrenched in your own ways. And then when a new paradigm comes, you just shit on it, right? That's what they did. They shat on it. Live was the innovation, and CNN's focus was, drumroll please, being live. They weren't focused on packaging the day's most important news into a tidy 30-minute show. That wasn't the goal. Their goal was to do live news better than anyone had ever done it before. That was the job to be done, damn it. So while it's one thing to write an article about focus, it's a completely different thing to build a company where live is the focus, and to do it in a way no one had ever done news before. Now, when I say CNN was different, I don't mean radically different, but different enough. It's the Maya saying I said in episode 1 of being most advanced yet accessible, where CNN's format was free-flowing as designed, but it was still news. In Porter Bibb's Ted Turner biography, Professor Andrew Stern, director of journalism school at UC Berkeley, told him, quote, CNN's reporters are not million-dollar names, but very often, what is reported is identical to the network news. The rest of it is pretty much a headline service. It's not as good, but it is not that bad. If Dan Rather weren't a recognizable star, it would be amazing how similar CBS and CNN would appear, end quote. Exactly. And that's the thing they don't understand. Now, what I'm about to discuss isn't as relevant today, but back in 1981, it was well known that if a major news event happened, it had the ability to shape viewers' habits and loyalties for years, potentially even decades. That is to say, if a network nailed its coverage of a huge news event, it earned trust and viewers stuck with them. But if a network botched their moment, it could be brutal, or at least as brutal as it gets for being one of three in a monopoly of news, right? And so here's a question for y'all. What's the biggest threat or worst case scenario to a triopoly of news organizations? Think about it. It's a fourth news organization, right? Money and resources aside, CNN's arrival was like shaking a magic 8-ball and guessing what might happen next. Nobody really knew. Everyone in New York City just assumed the money and expertise would be the differentiator. But that's what hubris does. It takes away the ability to see around corners or think differently, right? It takes away the ability to even imagine that a underfunded company could defeat you. But it happens. Now, as I've covered in earlier episodes, the big three networks had plenty of advantages, but they also had a surplus of arrogance, and they used it to try and stomp out this scrappy 24/7 news upstart all the time. But at first, CNN was generally treated as the fourth network, included in the White House's press pool in the 1980 campaign and the early days of Reagan's presidency. But it didn't take long for the networks to grow more critical and get more annoyed that CNN was there. God, this sounds like elementary school, during recess. And so CBS, which was the most powerful news network at the time, used its influence with the White House to get CNN removed from the White House press pool. Reese Schonfeld pushed back, saying, quote, "We don't think there should be pools. We can beat them one-on-one. We do it all the time, but we can't compete when all three networks get together and decide to freeze us out. The networks are refusing to recognize there's another player in the game," end quote. But the networks argued the White House pool was a one-way street. They were doing all the work, and CNN was getting all the benefits without anywhere near the same investment. CBS put it more bluntly, quote, "We don't want them in the pool because they can't contribute to it," end quote. Now, the networks had a number of reasons for excluding CNN from the White House pool. First, CNN was non-union. The networks weren't. Second, they didn't think CNN shared the same high-quality production values. And then, of course, there was money. You see, CNN didn't want to pay the same share of the pool costs since their audience was much smaller than the networks, which makes a lot of sense since we're talking about government coverage, right? But being shut out of the White House pool also meant CNN couldn't offer live coverage of the president, press conferences and stuff like that, which would hurt their credibility in Washington. And that really frustrated Ted. To make the most of CNN's greatest advantage, which was, yes, live news, they needed the same access the networks had to the White House. The situation infuriated Reese Schonfeld, who had spent decades fighting the old boys club mentality of the networks, where they conspired to shut out newcomers and kill competition. Excluding CNN from the pool wasn't just unfair, it was bad for TV and bad for the country. And so, on March 30th, 1981, in an incredible twist of fate, the very day Reese Schonfeld, Ted Turner, and CNN were planning to sue the networks and the White House for antitrust violations and First Amendment infringement over CNN's exclusion from the press pool, President Ronald Reagan was shot. The news world was thrown into chaos, and their lawsuit would have to wait for another day. But for Reese, what mattered now was proving a point that, quote, a pool for one was a pool for all, end quote, and that meant covering the Reagan shooting live, and most importantly, getting the story right. This was CNN's chance to cover a truly massive breaking story as it happened, as it unfolded, a moment that demanded accuracy and composure, and a real-time fight to prove they belonged on the same stage as the networks. So, first things first, talking about competition in the middle of a presidential shooting sounds odd, yes, but that was CNN's reality. They were already in a fight with the networks, with a lawsuit set to be filed that very day, and suddenly they had a chance to take on the big guys at their own game. The stakes couldn't have been higher for CNN, and everyone working there knew it. These are the moments that make TV must-see TV, the kind that have the ability to define a journalist's career or end it. And Reese's CNN was ready. This was their shot at the big leagues. In his memoir, Reese Schonfeld described March 30th, 1981, quote, everyone in America was watching television. Most viewers would be looking at the networks, some would be watching CNN, and some would surf. We had to look as good as the other guys. We had to capture the surfers. If we looked bad, we'd lose viewers forever, end quote. Now that day, CNN's White House crew was inside the Hilton in D.C. covering President Reagan's speech to the AFL-CIO. As President Reagan left the hotel, he was shot, along with a D.C. policeman, Secret Service agent, and Reagan's press secretary, Jim Brady. But since CNN didn't have their crew outside, they didn't get any of the footage. That said, there was pool coverage shot by ABC, but because CNN had been excluded from the White House press pool, they weren't supposed to have access to it. As the networks went live with breaking news, Reese made the call and told his team, take it, tape it, and run it. You see, this wasn't just a national emergency, it was also a business emergency. Sure, the networks were furious that CNN was taking their footage off the air and using it, but Reese simply told them, go ahead and sue us. Still, before airing the tape, CNN anchor Bob Kane broke into regular news programming with,
we interrupt. There's been a late development. Shots reported fired outside the hotel where President Reagan spoke a short while ago. Here's Bernard Shaw in our Washington bureau.
Now, at this point, neither man knew much of anything. On air, Bernard Shaw admitted as much.
Bob, as you can understand, details are very sketchy. We don't know precisely what happened, nor... Pardon me. Okay, my apology. Details are very sketchy at this moment. We don't know precisely what happened. We don't know the sequence. First of all, the president is safe. We are told that shots were fired at his party as he left the hotel. The District of Columbia Metropolitan Police report that at least one police officer and one Secret Service agent have been injured. They were shot down. Their condition, we do not know. We are checking both with the Secret Service and with people up at the hotel, as well as with the CNN crew and correspondent Bob Berkowitz. Briefly, we can report that shots were fired as President Reagan left the Washington Hilton Hotel following that address we carried live here on CNN. The president did not appear to be hurt, according to United Press International.
Shaw continued reading the Wire copy as it came in. Even though their initial report was very vague, CNN beat the other networks to the air by 4 minutes, which is an eternity in TV news. Reese later admitted, quote, to its tiny audience, this didn't matter. To their broadcast competitors, it was proof CNN meant business, end quote. Because CNN's sole focus was live news, Bernard Shaw couldn't afford to wait for all the facts before going live on the air. That's how the networks operated, but not CNN. This was a different kind of story, one that was going to break in waves and play out like a movie. The challenge for everyone was staying live and staying accurate. But really, it was exactly the kind of story CNN was built for. Of course, everyone was figuring it all out in real time, flying by the seat of their pants. And while we know how it turned out now, back then, in the moment, it was absolute chaos. One producer even tried to push back on staying live, arguing, quote, "We don't have any information. We don't know anything," end quote. But the order from the top came back fast, quote, "It doesn't make any difference. Get Bernie back in the chair and get ready to go," end quote. God, I love this kind of stuff. It's all a battle, a real-time test, history unfolding live. And you have the upstart who is really trying to do their best. And you have the networks who are trying not to screw it up. But, there's a new paradigm because live coverage is there. Meanwhile, on ABC, anchor Frank Reynolds introduced an unedited 8-minute tape saying before pressing play, quote, "This is the first time any of us has seen this tape," end quote. And you can imagine ABC, they're nervous that CNN's going to outscoop them and how they're going to run this 8-minute tape without watching it, which is crazy. But what ABC and the other networks didn't realize at the time was this. The raw, unfiltered footage of the shooting was far more powerful and compelling than anything they could have edited for their 6:30 p.m. nightly news. TV was changing fast, and this was another moment that made that point crystal clear. Part of that shift was driven by technology. And Lisa Napoli's Up All Night, she explains how just 6 years earlier, when two women tried to shoot President Ford weeks apart, two different shootings, I had no idea, network news crews were still using film, not videotape. So I believe that would be 1975. So they're using film, not videotape. And film is not nearly as versatile and mobile as videotape, obviously, but it also meant the networks couldn't show anything on the air until the film was developed. It's not like Polaroid. It doesn't instantly develop. It's not like tape. You can't just shoot it and then throw it in the tape player. But CNN, it was built with immediacy and live in mind. CNN used videotape, which allowed them to move faster, and that speed forced the networks to rethink how they covered the news. It was a game changer, really. Take ABC, for example. As Frank Reynolds narrated 8 minutes of raw footage on ABC, which he had not seen himself, he told viewers they were watching something that happened just 15 minutes before. As it was not live, then while watching the footage on air in real time, Reynolds said it looked like Press Secretary Jim Brady had been shot in the head. Of course, that one observation triggered a wave of confusion and a cascading line of questions and phone calls from the anchor to a reporter asking, "Where's the president? Was he back at the White House?" "No, he was headed to the hospital." "Wait, the president's on the way to the hospital? Is he going there or is he being taken there?" Big difference there, right? Like I said, the tension was sky high and the stakes were enormous. You got to get it right. This is the president of the United States, for God's sake. Anchors across every network, ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, were asking questions no one had answers to. It was a fog of war situation, but for information. Now, at the hospital, CNN reporter Scott Barrett arrived with the White House press corps, which was the same group that had dismissed CNN, and CNN was planning to sue that same day. And as he walked in, Barrett overheard doctors saying the president had actually been shot, not just shot at. He was the first to break this crucial news. Reese Schonfeld described what happened next. Barrett called into CNN from the hospital, and incredibly, Bernard Shaw took his phone call live on the air.
Press Secretary James Brady had been rushed there.
Barrett reports the president was shot once in the left chest.
Who does?
Scott Barrett reported the president has been shot once in the left chest in the hospital.
Correspondent Scott Barrett, you may have heard that, sends word from the hospital that the president was shot in the left chest. Is that correct? Just a moment. Things are in a state of confusion, so please stay with us. We want to be certain that our information is correct. And I can hear the word coming over our two-way radio, Dan, but I'll wait for somebody in the back room to come up here and tell us. We had been reporting to you that the president was not injured. In fact, the White House has said the president was not hurt, but now we're getting some other word, and we have our man at the scene. I'm just going to pause here for a moment because we don't want to misreport. Okay, just a second, pardon me. Okay. While we are waiting just to tie down once and for all that, we're going to be, look, can we hold for just a moment? What is the correct word?
He's not in surgery yet. He's conscious.
Okay, the president, shot once in the left chest near the, okay, Daniel Shore, we've just been given this hard word. The president was shot once in the left chest near the left arm. According to Lynn Nofsinger, the president is conscious.
It's pretty incredible drama, right? Not to be callous, but this was exactly what live TV was made for. A phone call happening live on the air from the hospital where the President of the United States of America was being treated after a shooting. And the thing is, no one knew how bad it was or what condition he was in. It's pretty intense. The moment, the silence, the weight, the tension. I have goosebumps right now. Now imagine being a CNN viewer. You're watching Bernard Shaw while he's live on the phone with a reporter from the hospital asking questions about the president's health, his condition, and it's just silence on the other end. I mean, how could you turn it off? This would be impossible to turn off. I couldn't do it. Could you? You can't manufacture this kind of drama. Now, what Shaw did in that moment wasn't just good journalism or good TV. It was crucial for CNN's credibility. You see, Bernard Shaw was careful. He told the audience he wanted to double-check everything before reporting it as fact. Eventually, Sissy Baker was able to confirm that the president had indeed been in surgery for 2 hours and that his condition was stable and good. But when it came to Press Secretary Jim Brady, well, that's where things started to go sideways. That's when the network started to get the facts wrong, with each of them reporting that Jim Brady had died. Sissy Baker later said, quote, "On and off all day, there were conflicting reports that he was dead. Brady was shot through the head. He was in surgery for 7 hours." End quote. The problem was, Sissy Baker's father was Senate Majority Leader Howard Baker, and he had called her to tell her that Brady had died. He heard it from someone and then just passed it along to the big three networks and his daughter, who worked the assignment desk at CNN, who then passed the information to Bernard Shaw's writer and producer, Sandy Kenyon, who then passed the note to Shaw. So it's like this relay, and it's telephone. They say, tell a phone, tell a friend, and then you mess it up, right? But when Bernard Shaw got the note that Jim Brady had died, he did something that most in his seat wouldn't have. He ignored it. He just ignored the note. While the networks continued to report Jim Brady's death, Shaw's producer, Sandy Kenyon, kept handing him pieces of paper with messages saying, quote, "Jim Brady is dead, says ABC, NBC, CBS, and CNN sources," end quote. You know, just read it, say it. And yet, Shaw wouldn't read them or say it on the air. Instead, he stuck to what he could say, things like, quote, citing a top-level congressional source. Bernie repeated the story, then added, quote, "We are not sure. We have no official confirmation," end quote. Think about that. CNN had the same information as the networks. In fact, the network source was a CNN employee's father. And yet, Bernard Shaw refused to go with it until he could confirm it. And as a 24-hour news network, CNN could have easily walked back the error and retracted it just like the others did. But Shaw knew getting the story right was much more important than being first. Essentially, he wasn't going to kill a man without proof. And when Dan Rather went on the air for CBS and asked viewers to observe a moment of silence for Secretary Brady, Shaw still wouldn't budge. Not until he got confirmation. This is courage, guys. And while CNN had the news first, since it came from a CNN employee who was the daughter of the Senate Majority Leader, Shaw didn't think the senator's information was reliable enough, since it seemed like he hadn't actually witnessed the shooting himself, nor was he in the hospital. Think about that. So Shaw is on the air live, and he's getting past these notes saying Jim Brady's dead, and he doesn't think it's reliable, and he's thinking on his feet that fast? It's unbelievable. Eventually, Shaw relented, telling viewers that CNN had learned from a top-level congressional source that Jim Brady had died. But then he hedged, telling viewers, quote, "We are not sure. We have no official confirmation. This is just one report. Brady, in fact, may be alive," end quote. So he's keeping him alive. And in a world known for groupthink, where everyone just follows the leader after one person breaks the news, Bernard Shaw didn't. Behind the scenes, Shaw's producer, Sandy Kenyon, remembered the newsroom getting restless. Folks are asking, what's wrong with our guy? What's the matter with Bernard Shaw? Why won't he just say it? Then, as more information started to trickle in, the story began to shift. It was like that wave I described earlier, like a movie. Kenyon described it, quote, like a huge train that has been going forward and then starts to back up. I've been sending Bernie increasingly desperate notes, and then the train just backs up and backs up and backs up. Now Frank Reynolds is on ABC, pounding his desk, boom, 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 and saying, let's get this right. And everybody has to say the man isn't dead. He's still alive. Everybody except Bernie, end quote. Why? Because Bernard Shaw had it right all along. Okay, now to tie a bow on the story, after covering the story for more than 21 straight hours, Bernard Shaw and Sandy Kenyon went out for a drink. Kenyon felt like he'd witnessed something extraordinary. A journalist at the top of his game, fully in command, locked in, as they say. And as they walked into the bar, he asked Shaw, why wouldn't you declare Jim Brady dead? Bernard Shaw responded, Howard Baker wasn't at the hospital. He was a secondary source of a high order, but he wasn't in the room. For Bernard Shaw, being in the room was all that mattered. It was the difference between life and death. Amid the chaos that day, with tips and information flying in from every direction, what counted for CNN, a budding 24-hour news network, wasn't just getting the story, but getting the story right. And in the end, Shaw's performance that day did more for CNN than anyone ever could have imagined, as it elevated the network's credibility and cemented Shaw as one of their top journalists for decades to come. And of course, when word came that Jim Brady was actually still alive, the networks had to awkwardly retract their reports. This wasn't just a lesson in the danger of rushing to be first. It was something bigger. It was a turning point in how TV journalism worked. Because for one of the first times ever, watching the news didn't mean watching a neatly packaged recap of what had happened. It meant watching history unfold in real time. And as Lisa Napoli wrote in her excellent history of early CNN, Up All Night, quote, news, in other words, had become sports, end quote. Boom. Now, remember on that same day President Reagan was shot, CNN had actually planned to file a lawsuit against the networks and White House for violating antitrust laws and the First Amendment because they'd been kicked out of the White House press pool. It was pretty incredible timing. Fast forward a couple of months to May 11, 1981, when Ted Turner filed a federal lawsuit in Atlanta naming CBS, ABC, and NBC as defendants, as well as the President of the United States, White House Chief of Staff James Baker, Deputy Press Secretary Larry Speakes, and Secretary of State Alexander Haig. And for good measure, they also sued Uncle Sam. Just kidding, I'm just seeing if you're paying attention. They didn't sue Uncle Sam. Now, this was one of the most important lawsuits ever brought to expand access to the news. And Ted's case centered around CNN's exclusion from the White House press pool. He believed the networks were colluding with the White House to keep CNN on the outside, where they couldn't share resources or footage from the White House, and therefore would be unable to compete or be taken seriously as a news network. Ted stated, quote, the Constitution guarantees us equal access to newsworthy events in the White House, and by God, equal access is what we intend to have, end quote. As part of their lawsuit, Ted demanded a jury trial and unspecified monetary damages, saying, quote, the networks in the White House conspired and combined to violate the U.S. Constitution by denying CNN due process of law and freedom of speech, end quote. He also accused the networks of breaking antitrust laws guaranteeing CNN's right to free trade, saying, quote, for over 15 years, CBS, ABC, and NBC have been the principal participants in the market for the production of TV news programming. They have enjoyed a monopoly in this market. Our efforts to break this monopoly outside the legal process have been fruitless, and we are now forced to take this action, both for the good of the news business and for the good of the American people, end quote. Now, Ted's points here aren't sour grapes. They are valid, But taking on not just the networks, but also the White House and the aforementioned officials was going to be a battle. He doesn't need more battles, but this was a necessary one, according to him. Even Fred Friendly, the former head of CBS News, admitted, quote, "From the beginning of Washington journalism, some news organizations have been given preferential treatment. What's surprising is that no one until CNN ever challenged the rules," end quote. Well, leave it to Turner to make more history. CNN was already challenging the status quo on TV, and now they were taking it to court. Publicly, the White House dismissed the lawsuit's merits, and the networks pretended it wasn't a big deal. Nothing to see here. But behind the scenes, they were concerned. An official press release from NBC stated, quote, "Pool material has always been available to anyone wanting it, including the cable news network. CNN has always gotten the material for charges far below cost. CNN just isn't willing to make the financial commitment to the pool," end quote, which is true. But also, why should they? Their reach is significantly lower than the networks. Now, should CNN have paid the same amount as the networks despite having a much smaller audience? I don't know. I think if CNN had been owned by a fellow New Yorker, things might have been settled quickly. But it's also worth noting that the networks were getting really sick of Ted's antics, and he wasn't slowing down either. Nor was his mouth going to stop running. Just ask ABC. They found out the hard way when they tried to book satellite time to air Prince Charles' wedding live from London, only to learn that CBS, NBC, and CNN had already locked up all the available feeds. Grinning ear to ear, Ted said, quote, "Suddenly ABC was reminded what the word pool means," end quote. Reese explained the fight against the networks, quote, "I've been fighting network pools since 1963. The networks made up their own rules as they went along, and I was forced to battle over every issue. At CNN, I thought it might be easier. We were prepared to bear the burdens of a full pool member. That meant we would cover the White House for the pool 1 month out of 4. NBC, CBS, and ABC would also cover 1 month out of 4. We would have a regular spot in the pool rotation. The network unions threatened to strike if we became a pool member. They told the networks that they wouldn't handle tape that CNN shot, since CNN was a non-union company. Ergo, the tape was non-union tape. The networks themselves didn't want CNN in the pool, and they were certainly not prepared to fight the unions for us. I tried reason. I met with the network news divisions, attempting to work something out. Ralph Goldberg was at the time the chief lawyer for CBS News. He remembers the meetings. Quote, "Inside CBS, everybody thought Reese was a pain in the ass," end quote. Now, if you're taking on an incumbent, it often helps to have your own pain in the ass on the team, right? It's the whole saying, he's an asshole, but he's our asshole. Well, that was Reese. He cared. He gave a damn, and he fought hard for CNN. So while CNN had built a much more efficient system for running a news operation, the networks were still giants, and they did everything their way, even if it was the old school way, which was both slow and expensive. Reese explained, quote, "We wanted to pay our share of the pool in kind, while they were insisting we pay in dollars. They thought we were just trying to get pool material on the cheap. We knew that we could do better than they could at half the price," end quote. And that's true. They could at half the price, but you still need that access. Now, here's what's interesting to me. President Reagan, a Republican who supported right-to-work laws, had once served as president of SAG, Screen Actors Guild, which is the actors union in Hollywood. It's kind of a toss-up. Whose side is he going to be sympathetic to? The union side, which is going to be more of the networks, or the Republican side, which is going to be the non-union aspect, which is CNN. Instead, he didn't challenge the networks or unions and stuck with traditional broadcasting, probably because it helped him reach more Americans. CNN tried everything to make their case to the White House on the unfairness of the situation. Reese said they argued on principle while the White House was playing politics. But in the end, Ted and Reese knew what they had to do. Ted had been battling the networks for the better part of a decade, and this was their shot to make them pay in court. So when CNN filed suit, the networks predictably went nuts, and while the White House wasn't thrilled either, Reese said he could sense a feeling of begrudging admiration coming from the Reagan administration, since they were also a little frustrated with the networks themselves. They kind of liked seeing someone making them squirm. And you know who had that effect? That's right, Ted Turner. I mean, it's rich, right? The networks who were always preaching the First Amendment were now refusing CNN access to the White House pool for reasons of production value, union rules, and money. And let's be honest, they were also punching down. And in a popularity contest, that's rarely a good look, right? But you know who did know how to win a popularity contest? That's right, Ted Turner, the people's champion and true folk hero. When it came down to CNN's business rationale for the lawsuit, Reese said, quote, "Our crews cost us about $60,000 a year. The network's crews cost more than $150,000, and the networks always padded the bill. At pool events, when the network people ate together, the saying was, the pool is picking up the check," end quote. If CNN paid cash instead of contributing services to the pool, they'd be forced to absorb part of the network's bloated salaries and expenses, which had the potential to put them out of business. Not good, right? Still, Reese felt good about their chances. Quote, "We would either be admitted to the pool or as a backup, the networks who barred us from participating would have to give us pool material for nothing. I estimated that if they had permitted us into the pool, we would have saved $2 million a year. And if they had been forced to give us pool material for nothing, we would have saved $4 million a year," end quote. I mean, that's real money. So CNN sued on antitrust grounds, accusing the networks of colluding to push them out of business. CNN argued the networks shared footage with each other, but not with CNN. And that was a serious problem. And just like that, the lawsuit had an immediate impact. Network lawyers sent a warning to their newsrooms, quote, "Don't do this anymore, if you've ever done it," end quote. Which to me is legal lingo for stop doing this, you idiots. You could cost us our licenses. Remember, they are broadcasters and they are beholden to the FCC, who can renew or take away their license. And sensing an opportunity to strike, Ted went to Washington, D.C. to make some noise. Once again, he held a press conference, his favorite thing, this time calling for an immediate congressional investigation into network programming to, quote, "determine whether it has a detrimental effect on the morals, attitudes, and habits of the people of this country," end quote. I guess his thinking was if he already had the networks on their heels, might as well go for the jugular and go after the programming in addition to the news. Why not, right? Why not go after their programming too? Ted demanded that the networks return to airing more wholesome programming like Leave It to Beaver, claiming, quote, "all three networks are operating in lockstep, in cartel-like fashion. They are totally irresponsible, and consciously or unconsciously, they are tearing this nation down and tearing it apart," end quote. Now, this kind of attack wasn't risk-free. And by that, I mean going after the networks so publicly, Ted kind of risked waking the bear being Congress, who just 2 years before had punted on retransmission consent, and that was just for the time being. I covered that back in episode 5, but Ted couldn't help himself, and I can't blame him because he was riding high, kicking ass, and taking names, right? Remember, Ted's 1979 fight in Congress over retransmission, it was Ted and the cable industry against the networks, Hollywood, sports leagues, and local affiliates. And how Ted's practice of paying local rights fees for nationwide rights was a growing problem for the studios and syndicators who supplied programming for his superstation, and they weren't just going to let it slide. Ted bluntly said, quote, "We're at war with everybody. Now we have lawsuits against the three networks, the White House and Westinghouse, who I'll discuss in a bit, and we're winning. Or at least, we haven't lost yet," end quote. So Ted went back to D.C., trying to rally support for CNN getting access to the White House press pool, which they needed because that's where the key footage was, and being part of the pool would give CNN credibility as a serious news outlet. But here's the kicker. Washington still wasn't wired for cable. That meant most lawmakers who were hearing about CNN, whether in the newspapers, on the networks, or from Ted himself, couldn't actually watch CNN. Not in their homes, not in their offices. And let's be real, how do you take a new disruptive channel seriously if you can't even watch it? It's total guesswork, right? It's like being told that MTV is this Trojan horse to destroy the minds of Americans, and then you watch it and you're like, wow, Pat Benatar is pretty good. So once he realized this, he moved fast to implement a brilliant solution. He installed a $13,000 satellite dish in the House of Representatives and then wired up every congressman's office. Smart move. Reminds me of how in the early days of Twitter and Facebook, their comms teams would make sure everyone in Congress had access to their services with the right handles and such, kind of like a white glove service. Remember, whenever the networks went to Congress, it was normally to complain. Here Ted is giving them free cable. And Ted didn't stop there. Since CNN had 24 hours to fill each day, he offered Congress something the networks rarely did: airtime. On the networks, unless you had seniority or chaired a major committee that was actually in the news at the time, good luck getting on TV. But on CNN, you had a platform where you could speak directly to the American people far more often than ever before. I think it was a pretty brilliant move. Then, in early 1982, CNN got the break it needed when Judge Brenda Evans of the United States District Court of Georgia issued a landmark ruling saying that CNN's exclusion from the White House TV pool, quote, denies the public and the press their limited right of access guaranteed by the First Amendment, end quote. Judge Evans's ruling instantly put CNN on equal footing with the big three networks, and soon after, all parties agreed to let CNN in, with the official statement saying, quote, no inequality of personnel, equipment, or competence as among CNN, ABC, CBS, and NBC, end quote. Still, CNN's victory didn't come cheap. It came at a price, with legal fees and expenses costing nearly $2 million, and under the ruling, they had to invest at least $1 million in new technical equipment to handle overseas pool assignments. But here's the good news. They didn't have to pay the same share of costs as the networks. Instead, they'd cover a minimum of 1/6 of the total pool expenses. Still a stretch financially, especially with another big battle looming against one of the major networks. But I'll get to that soon. Now, in CNN's first 2 years on air, there were tons of major global news stories. And I can't possibly talk about all of them here, otherwise this show will never end. But I do want to quickly touch on a few before moving on to Ted's biggest fight to this date, which I feel like I've said in every episode, and somehow he keeps on winning them, right? It's pretty amazing. First up, October 6, 1981, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat was assassinated during a military parade in Cairo. Now, this was a massive international story, and one of the rare times CNN didn't have any footage to go with. That said, CBS did, and aired it immediately. ABC did too, and broke into their regular programming to run it. Meanwhile, CNN, 24/7 news network, had nothing, which was a big problem. Fortunately, the new rules requiring the network share pool footage kicked in. ABC's lawyers even told them to share their footage with CNN. By 6 p.m. that same day, CNN finally had the footage, and most viewers never even noticed they'd missed it. Second on my list of big early news moments was the launch of the Space Shuttle Columbia on April 13th, 1981. Now, this was a big deal as well. The first time in 6 years the United States was sending astronauts into space, and 80,000 people were invited to watch it in person. I believe that was at Cape Canaveral as well. But for everyone else not invited, they'd have to rely on the networks or CNN. Now, nothing crazy happened with this launch, but I think it's worth describing the scene just to show the difference in mentality between CNN and the networks. Reese Schonfeld described it like this, quote, "We arrived at Cape Canaveral with a guerrilla cadre. The networks had sent hundreds of people. We sent 12. Our 12 proved superior to their army. We had airtime. The networks didn't. Our trump card was our anchor and leader, Bill Zimmerman. He was the best all-around newsman at CNN. He had never been a space correspondent, but like the best journalist, his character was to know everything about everything. By the time he got to Cape Canaveral, he knew as much about space as the guys who'd been covering it for years." End quote. Bill Zimmerman said, quote, "Moving to CNN was like moving from first class to steerage and fomenting a rebellion after you got there. We started an uprising against the people in first class, the networks," end quote. Listen to those words. It's very Star Wars, first class to steerage, and then fomenting a rebellion after you got there. Uprising, taking on the people in first class, the networks. It's an example of the mindset every underdog needs. In any David and Goliath corporate battle, this kind of mentality isn't just for team morale. It's essential because you're not just fighting for attention. You're taking on giants with more money, more resources, and more people to throw at every problem. And in order to beat them, you need belief, grit, and a chip on your shoulder. What's that saying? Chips on shoulders, put chips in pockets? Me? Give me a small team any day. A big mission with huge goals and a dream? That's how you move mountains, right? Even back in 1981 and 82, the size of the established corporate media was massive. They had money, they had prestige, but what they didn't have was speed, or the willingness or ability to really try new things unencumbered. Now, I'll talk more about CBS founder Bill Paley at length later, but as he got older and CBS evolved from a company into an institution, he grew frustrated. And what bothered him most was the loss of good old-fashioned entrepreneurial spirit. It's not that people weren't proud to work at CBS. They absolutely were, and rightfully so. But the culture had shifted. It went from being a place focused on winning to something that felt more like academia. And when that happens, well, some habits are hard to change, right? Heck, Google's trying to make that shift right now. Anyways, I'm going to give a quick State of the Union on TBS and CNN, just so that we're on the same page on early revenue, viewership growth, etc., just so you have a good handle on everything at this point, which is about 1.5 years into CNN being on the air. So, by October 1981, CNN was thriving, with revenue surpassing $3 million a month. Ted and his small team had built the 24-hour news network for just over $35 million. And they were already close to breaking even, which is pretty remarkable when you consider things like the economy in 1981 was still likely in a recession, the networks were still dominant and provided competition, CNN was tangled up in lawsuits and all the behind-the-scenes drama from that. Oh, and they were running a 24/7 news operation that was built from scratch. God, I felt like Norm Macdonald when I said that. Still, by October 81, CNN was growing fast, reaching 13.9 million cable households, with nearly 6 million viewers a week. They were scooping the networks more and more, and even earning a bit of praise and respect from their competition. When Time magazine asked ABC senior news executive Richard Wald what he thought of CNN, he said, quote, CNN does a nice, straightforward, basic rendition of the news, very competently, end quote. Now, that might not sound like a rave review, but in 1981, it was basically a standing ovation. Still, CNN's first 2 years definitely turned heads, and if it wasn't for new competition on the horizon, which I'll get to very shortly, CNN was on track to become a serious moneymaker for Turner Broadcasting. Now, 1981's TBS annual shareholders meeting was a casual affair, held at the Stadium Club at Fulton County Stadium, with maybe 40 or so folks in the room to hear what Ted might say. Not that it really mattered, because he owned 87% of the company, so it was kind of more of an entertainment kind of thing. But as always, those in attendance weren't disappointed. Listening to Ted confidently run through the numbers, toss out predictions, and then launch into a few tirades was a lot of fun. At that meeting, he announced, quote, "It is possible that the company will break even in fiscal 1982 and return to profitability in 1983, end quote. And that's pretty incredible when you launch such a big venture like CNN and the capital costs, and they're keeping on going up, and you have talent, and you have all that stuff. And then he also announced that he was close to securing a new $50 million line of credit from Citibank after deciding to scrap the stock offering from the previous winter, which I mentioned earlier in the episode. Then, Ted casually announced his intention to make, quote, Atlanta the major motion picture production center in the United States, end quote, and announced a new $100,000 square foot film and television studio on Techwood Drive. Contingent, as always, on, you got it, available financing. Casual, right? Well, that didn't exactly happen in 81 and 82, but Disney and Marvel helped make Atlanta a major motion picture city in the 2010s, so anything's possible over time, right? Last, Ted went over rumored offers from companies about buying or merging with CNN, saying that only, quote, one major company has, in fact, offered me the key to the corporation, but there is no reason why we would want to merge with anyone. We're the fastest growing company in the nation, I believe, or certainly in the communications industry. I don't feel I'd be a good division head in anybody else's company, end quote. All right. So TBS and CNN were cooking with gas. And speaking of not being a good divisional head and being a leader, in February 1982, Ted, eager to broaden CNN's horizons, as well as his own, accepted a personal invitation from the president of Cuba, Fidel Castro, to visit. The trip was full of wild stories and classic quotes like, quote, Fidel ain't a communist, he's a dictator, just like me, end quote. You know, classic Ted. It's the story of how a Southern kid obsessed with Alexander the Great ended up trying to play peacemaker on the global stage. And while I'd love to give it more time, it'll be another hour and a half if I go all into their trip. I'm going to save it for a potential bonus episode. We'll see. You got to let me know if we should do that episode. Ted and Fidel's Cuba Bromance coming soon. Let me know. Ted Turner once said, quote, it was basically a defense, but in defending, you often attack. We were holding the ground. I figured, knowing that there were two big companies and that they were both public corporations, that if their losses were bigger than anticipated, the people in charge of this project would come under criticism. And I knew if they ran into difficulties, there'd be friction between the partners. You're much better off competing against a split command because they spend a lot of time trying to figure out what to do, and it's easier for them to get into an argument. So even though we were strapped financially and they had resources 100 times greater, I knew that in a war of attrition, we'd lose, end quote. In Rune Arledge's memoir, Roon, who at the time was running ABC News, recalled a moment with Ted Turner in the men's room at a White House state dinner right around the time CNN was getting started. Ted turned to him and said, quote, "I'm going to kill you network guys. I'm going to hire college kids and you're going to pay grown-ups, and I'm going to kill you," end quote. Now, bathroom setting aside, this was a meaningful exchange between two of the greatest programming minds in TV history. And Ted's comment cut right to the heart of one of CNN's biggest advantages: costs. Fast forward 2 years to 1982, Ted and Roon wouldn't be standing shoulder to shoulder in the White House bathroom. Instead, they'd be going head-to-head against each other in a news battle with far bigger stakes. But before we get there, I need to take you all back to 1980. We got to set the stage. On October 16, 1980, just 4.5 months after CNN launched, Westinghouse and Teleprompter agreed to a $646 million merger. The deal combined Westinghouse, which was at the time the country's biggest non-network broadcaster, and Teleprompter, the largest owner of cable systems. Think of them like a Comcast or a Charter today. And the deal didn't just make business sense, it signaled a serious move into cable news. Westinghouse's Group W had already pioneered the all-news format for local TV, and now they had the scale and reach to go national. All they needed was the resources. Meanwhile, the networks kept insisting cable wasn't affecting their ratings, but rumors were circulating everywhere that ABC, CBS, and NBC were all working on their own competing news cable channels. And while each network was rumored to be developing their own CNN killer, none of them wanted to do it alone because they knew it would be super expensive. And who could blame them? They were already each spending over $100 million a year just to produce their nightly news. 30 minutes of news each day for over $100 million a year. What would it cost them to do news 24/7? Think about it. Honestly, I told you I had a C average in math in high school, but I know that dropping $100 million for just 30 minutes of news a day and then making that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, that means you got to have some deep pockets and know-how, right? But everyone just assumed that the deeper the pockets and know-how, the better the odds they would win, right? Still, where there's smoke, there's fire, and CNN's arrival lit a competitive spark under the networks. Publicly, they kept calling CNN a cheap knockoff of what they did every night, even though they only aired 30 minutes of news a day. But behind the scenes, it was clear real competition was coming, and it was shaping up to be one of the defining battles in cable's history. Now, as fate would have it, Ted Turner and CNN President Reese Schonfeld shared the same November 19th birthday, and they decided to celebrate together over dinner in 1980. At the end of dinner, Ted turned to Reese and asked him, quote, "What would you do if you wanted to put CNN out of business?" End quote. Now, Reese really understood the network news landscape and the competition and what their best path to hurting CNN would be. So he didn't hesitate when he said, quote, "short form, headline news," end quote. Now, a headline news service was simple. It was basically a repeating loop of short news updates, like all news radio, but on TV. But what's really interesting is that this was the exact idea Ted originally had for CNN. That is, before Reese convinced him to go bigger with his randomonium concept, the free flow and river of news. So Ted told Reese to make a schedule and a budget, just in case, to which Reese asked, "Why compete with ourselves?" Ted responded, "If we're going to have competition, it might as well be us." A few days later, Reese handed Ted his plan, complete with a budget and schedule for the short-form headline news network. Ted, being Ted, didn't even look at it. Instead, he put it in his desk drawer, saving it for a rainy day. A day he might actually need it. And that is awesome and classic Ted. Didn't even look at it, just puts it in the drawer. Now, that's how some of the best founders and CEOs think. They're constantly looking around their market and asking questions like, who's our next competitor? What if someone merges? What's the move nobody sees coming? Lots of what ifs, right? Kind of the stuff that the networks never asked. And now Ted exists and they have to ask. It's basically the business version of war games being played out in their heads. And the best leaders, they're not just looking ahead, they're looking around corners. Take Apple in the mid-2000s under Steve Jobs. Sure, they could have kept making billions off iPods every year, but they saw what was coming. They saw the phone companies were starting to put MP3s in their cell phones. They knew that to level up, they had to build the iPhone, even if it meant cannibalizing their own dominant, massively popular product. That's what it takes to win, to be bold. Ted Turner understood that. Ted didn't want to sit back now that CNN was a modest success. He wanted to dominate. Heck, the same month of their fateful dinner, just 5 months after launching, Reese admitted, quote, by the end of November 1980, we all knew that CNN had made it, end quote. But that was only if real competition didn't arrive, and Ted knew it would. You see, Ted had proven a new world or new market worked, and when you discover something that big, it never stays yours alone for too long. This is the type of mentality that separates the good from the great from the best. Only the paranoid survive. CNN had already proved it could deliver 24 hours of news every day on a shoestring budget. And while Ted wasn't afraid of failure, he was afraid of someone doing it better and hurting both of them at the same time. So, why not plan for the inevitable, right? And sure enough, 8 months after their birthday dinner in July of 1981, Reese heard whispers that the newly merged Westinghouse Broadcasting, the same company that invented all-news radio, was planning an all-news cable channel. And as predicted, they weren't going to the dance alone. Their dance partner? Roone Arledge's ABC News. Now here's where it gets a little richer. Dan Ritchie, Group W's CEO, hated CNN. He thought Ted had stolen the idea for 24-hour news from his company since they'd created all-news radio, and now he wanted payback, but needed a partner. So Ritchie called ABC chairman Leonard Goldenson, and just like that, they quickly agreed to build a cable news service together. ABC News boss Roone Arledge said it would be the TV version of, quote, you give us 22 minutes, we'll give you the world, end quote. While Ritchie didn't know much about news himself, when he talked to his team's researchers, they told him two key things. One, cable operators didn't want to pay for news. And two, cable viewers wanted more local news. So Ritchie came up with a simple plan. Offer his news channel to cable operators for free, which would undercut CNN, which was charging cable operators 15 cents per month per subscriber. And then to sweeten the deal, they'd include 6 minutes of local news every half hour. Smart, right? In a way, it was a lot like when the Superstation went nationwide on cable and how Ted gave it away for free. You know, would you take a channel that was free, or would you take one that required you pay 15 cents per subscriber? It's a pretty obvious answer, right? While his plan looked good on paper, thankfully we live in the real world where paper is just theoretical until action happens, right? Because Ritchie's plan completely overlooked one major issue. How were local stations supposed to finance and schedule those local segments? In Roone Arledge's memoir, he wrote, quote, on paper, it was an intriguing idea. ABC had an increasingly successful news division with bureaus and outposts strung around the world, and Westinghouse was in the process of adding teleprompter to its already substantial cable holdings. CNN, on the other hand, was available only on 25 of the country's 115 cable systems. We intended to lower that number to none by paying operators 50 cents a household per month to carry SNC. Ted Turner wouldn't be able to compete for very long, end quote. Now, this is after the fact, obviously, when he wrote that. And so SNC is the name of the channel, satellite news channel. You know, I just said that they gave it away for free. They also paid a lot of cable operators to bring SNC onto their systems. They were paying for carriage, which is the opposite of what you want to do, really. But if it got you in that market, more power to you, right? You know, this is a real competitor who was really rich and strategically sound. Now, one of Westinghouse's biggest advantages was that they now own Teleprompter, which is the largest cable operator in the country at the time. And it just so happened that Teleprompter included Manhattan's West Side, which was a cable system CNN had been trying and failing to get on since day one. And they never knew why. Why can't we get carriage in New York City? Well, now they knew why. To Ted, this was a declaration of war, and like any great general, he already had a plan sitting in his desk drawer, and all he had to do was pull out Reese's memo and put it into action. He didn't waste a second. As soon as he heard about the ABC-Westinghouse deal to launch a competitor, satellite news channel, Ted opened the drawer, grabbed the memo, and told Reese, do it. They were going to build and launch what they initially called CNN2, but you know it as headline news. So I might use those interchangeably. They're the same thing. CNN2 was what it was going to be called at first. It became headline news. But now they had to match Westinghouse's game plan by offering this new channel to cable operators for free, in addition to CNN, and including a 5-minute local news window at the end of each half hour, which meant all of those profits Ted had bragged about at the TBS shareholder meeting, yeah, they were going to need to be reinvested fast. It was go time, because now it was a race, and whoever made it to market first would win. Now, it's been a while since I've shared one of Ted Turner's trademark motivational quotes. We'll one day do a motivational quote episode, I'm sure, but this feels like the perfect time, especially with Ted's battle against ABC-Westinghouse's upcoming cable news service heating up. Quote, think things through as much as you can, then give it 100%. Always be cheerful, never get discouraged, and never quit. Because if you never quit, you're never beaten. End quote. At this point, the battle lines were still forming, though nothing had been announced officially yet. Sure, there were rumors, leaks, whispers, murmurs, but no official announcements. Ted's biographer, Porter Bibb, noted, quote, Ted released the results of a new Nielsen audience study, a study billed by Turner as the most extensive ever conducted on the national cable television audience. The Nielsen survey showed that cable viewers rated CNN equal to or better than network news coverage, end quote. Not long after, a major milestone arrived signaling CNN's official arrival. It was, yes, the official announcement of a direct competitor, because you're not really the king if nobody tries to take your crown, right? And so, on August 12, 1981, ABC-Westinghouse made it official, announcing they were launching a 24-hour news service called Satellite News Channel. It would follow a wheel format, just like the plan Reese had outlined in his memo to Ted. SNC, Satellite News Channel's launch, was set for April 1st, 1982, with a second, more in-depth news channel, which was more similar to CNN, planned for later that year. So their channel that they're planning is similar to headline news today. You know, it goes news, sports, weather, and then local. They also took a page from Ted's playbook by choosing to launch from a non-union state, Connecticut, instead of New York. And to top it off, in a bold move, they were offering SNC to cable operators for free, and sometimes, like Roone Arledge just said, even paying some to carry it. ABC didn't hold back, declaring in no uncertain terms that their goal was to, quote, knock Turner out of the box, end quote. Now, imagine a company, any company, saying something like this so publicly today. I miss the kind of old-school corporate trash talk when legacy giants weren't afraid to punch up or punch down at startups and brash founders. It doesn't happen anymore, but it was fun. Of course, SNC's official announcement didn't surprise anyone at Turner, but it did kick them into high gear. Still, there were real concerns inside CNN. Reese Schonfeld worried that launching a second channel, CNN2, would cost $15 million, and that could mean cuts to CNN's already stretched, albeit growing budget, which was nearing $50 million a year at the time. With money still tight, Reese suggested cutting or even eliminating the fees CNN charged cable operators, that 15 cents a month per subscriber, just to keep them from dropping CNN in favor of the free SNC. But Ted refused. He didn't want to show weakness. Instead, launching another news channel would send a message. We're not backing down. We don't give in to bullies. To Ted, just defending CNN wasn't enough. He'd already invested every dollar back into the network, and with great results. But this time, even he admitted they might not survive a long fight against a rival with deeper pockets and nearly unlimited resources. Ted told Reese, quote, I know we can never win a war of attrition, end quote. And I think Ted was probably right. ABC and Westinghouse didn't just have deep pockets. They had experience. They had muscle. Infinite resources, really. Think about it. Westinghouse owned the largest group of TV and radio stations in the country. They just bought Teleprompter, the biggest cable operator in the country. And don't forget ABC had a 15% stake in ESPN, which gave them even more leverage with cable systems. Plus, they had Westinghouse's all-news radio network and ABC News, which meant they had the man behind ABC News, Roone Arledge, who, if I may, Allow me to borrow a set of life rules from one of movie's greatest barroom philosophers, Douglas Coughlin from Cocktail. Coughlin had Coughlin's laws. Well, I've got Web Barr's laws. And one of them is if someone is universally known by just one name, like Madonna, Prince, or Rune, well, then you know they're a real player. So this wasn't just a fight with Westinghouse and ABC. Ted was also going up against Rune Arledge, one of, if not the greatest innovators and programmers in the history of television. Make no mistake, SNC was real competition. And to Ted, the only defense against ABC-Westinghouse was a full frontal, balls to the walls, preemptive attack. He didn't hesitate before making his own declaration, quote, "They're in for the fight of their lives," end quote. Like the great generals he'd studied since childhood, Ted already had a plan, and he was ready to move fast and strike almost immediately. So within weeks of SNC's announcement, Ted revealed CNN's Counterattack, a second news channel aimed directly at ABC-Westinghouse's SNC. Ted told reporters, quote, "I don't know exactly how long we can last, but I figure our only chance is to split the market," end quote. By splitting the market, Ted meant putting that plan, from November 1980 that was in his drawer into action. And if all went according to plan, CNN2 would beat SNC to the air by at least 3 months, because Ted announced the launch date of January 1st, 1982. Ted repeated that he was prepared to spend every cent he had to win. Again, his own money. The battle lines were drawn, and once again, it was time to see if Ted's rabbit could outrun the network's wolf. In the race to sign up cable systems for his new news network, Ted fired up his fellow cable operators by reminding them that ABC was a broadcaster and broadcasters wanted to destroy cable. At the same time, Ted was juggling other battles. He was staring down rising legal costs from CNN's White House pool lawsuit, which was still ongoing at this point. We just closed the loop on that earlier this episode. And he also feared Congress might pass new copyright laws that could drastically raise the royalties the superstation had to pay for programming. So, in other words, Ted had a lot of balls in the air, and every single one of them threatened the cash flow he relied on. Now, in preparing this season on Ted Turner, I read over 25 books, some of them multiple times. I can't think of a single time in the 1960s, 70s, or 80s where Ted played the victim, not once. He relished going up against bigger and stronger competition, and he understood the risk to his own business, which only made him fight harder to win. Yes, ABC and Westinghouse's satellite news channel had a number of clear advantages, but if you look closer, you'd notice that almost every one of them was theoretical and based on how things had worked before. They were based on, they have more money and more people, or what if you combine these two companies? It would be magical, synergy. But the future isn't always predicated on the past, right? Ted saw an opening and aimed to capitalize. For one, he believed SNC's split leadership meant slower decision-making. Two big corporate hierarchies meant twice the red tape. He wanted both companies, public giants in their own right, to know this was going to be a long, messy, expensive fight. Let me say that another way. SNC had a ton of advantages. The types that look awesome on paper or Excel docs, right? But it was also a joint venture between ABC and Westinghouse, two gigantic companies, each with their own complexities, own way of doing things, bureaucracies, and egos. So, while it's one thing to build a cable news channel at your own pace, doing it against Ted Turner, a guy who had already built and launched CNN, a 24/7 news network, in just 11 months, with his own money? Well, that's something else entirely. This battle was essentially the poster child for why efficient markets aren't always efficient, and why we have to play the game, not just talk about it, right? Sometimes the odds are against us, but we still have to show up. Regardless, Ted wasn't just taking on one big company, he was going after two. But even on their own, corporate giants like ABC and Westinghouse aren't exactly known for speed, agility, quick decision-making, are they? Even today, they're not. And since neither ABC nor Westinghouse had ever built anything like SNC before, Ted had a massive advantage. one that no one really wanted to talk about because they just looked at the personnel and the money. But just remember, it was the kind of advantage that wouldn't show up on our spreadsheets. This was just another fight and a long line of battles for Ted, and this time, he had no intention of backing down. In fact, Ted wouldn't have it any other way, saying, quote, "After all, we can never lose if we never give up," end quote. Now, I've explained what CNN's second channel would look like. You know, the same wheel format Ted originally wanted for CNN, with news, weather, business, and sports running on a 30-minute loop all day, every day. But CNN2, which would eventually be called Headline News, was also a double-edged sword. You see, it had to be better than SNC, but not too good, because it couldn't compete or outshine CNN. And building these kinds of parallel, similar products or similar channels inside of a media company is not easy. Remember, Headline News was going to be free for cable operators, just like SNC, while CNN still cost operators 15 cents per month per subscriber. So Headline News had to deliver more value than SNC without making CNN look less valuable in comparison. Now, I don't know about you, but making something that's just good enough, it's really hard. In fact, it might be harder than making something truly great. I mean, how do you tell your team, try hard, but not too hard? You know? Like, we don't want to kill the golden goose, which was CNN, but it still needs to beat the competition who are working their asses off to make a great product, right? Come to think of it, Apple deals with this every time they launch a new iPhone or MacBook, especially with their Pro models. You need the new product to shine, right? But not enough to tank the sales of the other one that's less expensive. It's a weird ask. And it's not great for morale either, because no one wants to think they're working on the B team, right? It takes real leadership to communicate a strategy like this, clearly and without blowback. And to make things even more interesting, Ted rolled out an $80 million ad campaign, both to support the Headline News launch and to keep pushing CNN. He announced it at a cable convention in Boston, where in a fiery speech he told the crowd he was going to throw everything he had at ABC-Westinghouse. And even if that wasn't enough, he knew he could count on his cable operating buds having his back. You know, they're getting SNC for free, so he's really playing up that angle. And to drive the point home, Ted got himself photographed in jeans and boots with a guitar in hand, kind of like the Marlboro Man, for posters that said, quote, "I was cable when cable wasn't cool," end quote. Then those shots, those big photographs of him like a Marlboro Man, cable when cable wasn't cool, were blown up on billboards outside every cable industry gathering across the country. It was a not very subtle reminder to the people controlling his distribution that Ted was their guy. You know, he was one of them, not some corporate suit outsider like ABC-Westinghouse. You know, come to think of it, this is probably the first time anyone at ABC or Westinghouse was an outsider. They were taking on, or at least trying to enter, an outsider business, right? Arthur Sandro, TBS's publicity chief, said the posters and billboards were meant to remind people, quote, what a pioneer Ted Turner really was. He had fought their battles and built their programming. And now it was time the cable industry showed Ted Turner they were behind him. That poster was just a reminder he'd been behind cable ever since he joined the industry, end quote. But Ted's preemptive attack wasn't just about launching his own rival to SNC. It was also about controlling and winning the narrative, both in the press and with cable operators. In speeches and interviews, Ted painted ABC as a threat to the very industry it was now claiming to love. You know, they used to hate cable. Now they love it? Come on. He pointed to ABC's quick exit from the failed cable arts channel as proof, calling it a loss leader meant to block real competition, only to disappear when it didn't make money. He was putting his money down. At the same Boston convention, Ted made something else clear. CNN2 would be free to any operator already carrying CNN. But he wasn't budging on CNN's carriage fees, telling the crowd, quote, when I cast my lot with the cable industry 10 years ago, I dreamed all three things would happen. It's not unexpected that second-wave companies, the three major networks, would figure out a way to get control of the news on your cable systems, end quote. Then he literally dropped the mic and launched into a 50-minute rant about all the time and money he'd spent lobbying in Washington on behalf of the cable industry, telling operators, quote, your battles have been my battles ever since I joined the industry. And then he told him, quote, "Timing is everything, and the good Lord and destiny are looking after both of us. If we had lost the retransmission consent battle, we'd all be a lot poorer. But we've won every important battle we've needed against those no-good SOBs who are trying to sneak in the door now." And to a packed standing room only crowd, he added, "Those no-good SOBs who are trying to sneak in the back door aren't about to put me out of business." End quote. In an open letter to cable operators, Ted quoted the chairman of ABC's Affiliates Committee, who had urged local stations to run stories portraying cable as a threat to free broadcasting, which to Ted was all the proof he needed that ABC was talking out of both sides of its mouth. That's dirty ball. Ted charged, quote, "With one hand, ABC embraces cable with its proposed satellite news channel, and the other is a dagger to put us away." Then he added, "ABC has said all along that broadcast is their first love and their first commitment. That's why I don't think they are going to get any clearances in the cable industry. And if they don't get clearances, they're not going to be able to stay in business." End quote. And Ted's war of words didn't stop with ABC. He went to speak at convention after convention with mayors and city council members from across the country, tearing into network TV, saying, quote, "Network television staple of sleazy sex and violence are contributing to the moral decay of our cities. Network news focuses on the bad news that depresses our people. They only mention public officials when there's a scandal. Their newsmen are bigger than the news. Who elected Walter Cronkite president anyway?" Then he urged the crowd of mayors and city councilmen to, quote, "Franchise and franchise quickly. Modern cable television. That's the modern way to communicate with your constituents. The future must be different in the communication field if we are to survive as a free nation." End quote. It's smart. He's appealing to their interests with communications, right? Meanwhile, he kept saying, quote, "The networks are in a state of panic. They're losing control of the news." End quote. Now, clearly, Ted was promoting his own interests, but also cable's and the audience was noteworthy. Cities were where cable could continue to grow, and cable wasn't in many cities at this point. These city councils and mayors would be the one determining how big of an impact cable was going to make in their areas, right? I know that when MTV launched in 1981, most of the MTV staff had to cross the river and watch the debut of the channel on, I think it was August 1st, 1981, in New Jersey in Englewood Cliffs. Ted even went as far as to claim that CNN had inflicted tremendous damage on the network's ratings. Was that hyperbole? Absolutely. But there was real concern that CNN staff would be rated to fill the 500-plus jobs needed to staff SNC's two new 24/7 news networks. One is fully announced and they're trying to launch it. The other is in the future. ABC-Westinghouse even set up a recruiting center in Ted Turner's backyard in an Atlanta hotel to try to poach CNN's overworked and underpaid employees, which was a bold and I would say unpredictable move from the very conventional play-by-the-rules JV, right? And while there were plenty of opportunities for junior-level roles at CNN2, all of the leadership roles at CNN2 or Headline News were locked in. Remember, the clock was already ticking towards their January 1st, 1982 launch. SNC's launch would be in April, supposedly, but CNN2's was 5 months away. They'd built CNN in 11 months. This time, they'd have less than half that. So, with the pressure on, Ted needed someone strong to run Headline News. Someone who lived by his favorite motto, lead, follow, or get out of the way. You could say he needed a dog. You could say he needed the Mad Dog. Enter Ted Mad Dog Kavanaugh, the perfect choice to lead the faster-paced Headline News against the better capitalized, theoretically stronger SNC. Now, Kavanaugh believed the news worked best when it ran like a railroad, with everything on track and on time, and he was a stickler for those kinds of details. And with Headline News' rigid loop format, short stories, rapid-fire segments, he was a natural fit. But remember, Headline News couldn't be as good as CNN, so at first, Reese didn't even let them run live news. And since it ran on 30-minute loops, Headline News would be very repetitive, so Kavanaugh focused on speed, expecting Headline News to leave SNC in their dust. Channeling Ted's mindset, he said, quote, We're going to preempt them by moving very quickly, end quote. Now, in TV terms, headline news was designed to have high reach but low ratings, meaning most viewers would likely tune in for a few minutes, get the gist of things, and then move on with their day. Headline news graphic designer Fran Heaney remembered, quote, Kavanaugh was a fabulous character, a kind of ninja newsman. He figured out the whole 30-minute wheel in 2 seconds, and then organized an entire editorial organization even before they had finished putting up our new building, end quote. As expected, he relished the opportunity to build a news channel from scratch and was all in. Remember, just 2 years earlier, he'd been out of work. He was known for wearing a pistol on his leg and being difficult to manage, not because he lacked passion for the job, but because he was too passionate. He was too intense. But now, he had the perfect job, and Headline News had the perfect leader for taking on ABC-Westinghouse. He even told Headline News recruits, quote, we're going to do everything they say they're going to do, except ours will be first, and ours will be better. They have only money to lose, but we have everything to lose, end quote. Those are recruits he's telling that to. But some people are really geared towards taking on the establishment, and being an underdog. And that's what they needed. Now, when it came time to staffing the rest of the station, Kavanaugh asked Reese for CNN's best writers and producers. He's on a real deadline, and so talent can move that kind of faster. But Reese gave him the second best. Remember, Ted and Reese didn't want Headline News to be better than CNN. It needed to be good, but not too good. Content-wise, Kavanaugh added a crime section to set it apart a little bit, giving the new channel a slightly more tabloid feel. You can feel that when you watch Headline News, right? And with Ted's approval, Kavanaugh increased his development budget from $15 million to $20 million, constantly pushing Reese for more talent, more equipment, and more space. In record time, CNN headquarters architect Bunky Helfrich built a sleek new studio and production facility for Headline News next to CNN's basement newsroom, complete with sliding steel doors, which Kavanaugh insisted on in case of a terrorist attack. I told you he was a little bit kooky, but that's also awesome. Anyways, I love these men on a mission stories with all their little quirks, like sliding doors to protect against terrorism. They don't make them like they used to, but they needed someone like Kavanaugh to hit their January 1st, 1982 launch deadline, right? As they raced to build their SNC competitor, at one CNN meeting, someone asked Reese how Ted was holding up ahead of Headline News' launch. Reese replied, quote, Ted's happy. We're at war again. He continued, Ted's reaction to competition is to go on the offensive. It's the only way he knows how to respond. He feeds on risk, and his appetite is insatiable, end quote. As part of this war with ABC-Westinghouse, Ted became obsessed, spending a large amount of his time touring the country, making speech after speech, attacking the networks, especially ABC. And in those speeches, he highlighted internal ABC memos showing the network's efforts to stifle cable's growth, slamming their bloated budgets while calling out what he called jiggle shows like Charlie's Angels. Use your own imagination, kids. And guess what? The networks were listening, and they could hear him loud and clear. Just 6 weeks before Headline News was set to launch, ABC unexpectedly announced it was expanding its evening newscast from 30 minutes of news to a full hour. Of course, CBS and NBC followed suit because they always did. But in a world where you could be different and stand out, the network still followed the leader almost every time. It's interesting, right? Meanwhile, the media started paying closer attention. The headlines called it what it was, the TV news war of 1981-82. And while some saw Ted's advantages against the networks, most others didn't at all, or they didn't want to. First, the New York Times wrote, quote, watching all of this with a certain bemusement are the folks at Cable News Network, which provides 24 hours of news daily, including a 2-hour evening program from 8 to 10 p.m. each weeknight. Indeed, on breaking stories, CNN is sometimes the only live show in town. And now CNN is about to launch a news service, Headline News, which will offer yet another 24 hours of news programming each day. Then the Times asked, does Ted Turner know something that the networks don't? End quote. But not everyone shared the Times' optimism or a little bit of a fascination. A well-respected media study commissioned by Compton Advertising echoed the industry's sentiment. Quote, Turner will enjoy a short-term advantage, but the ABC-Westinghouse venture will dominate by 1990, end quote. The same study predicted Ted might even lead for 4 or 5 years, but said eventually, quote, a merger or outright sale will be necessary, end quote. Forbes was a little more blunt. Quote, most men might then sell out and go away rather than crash in flames, which is increasingly likely to be Ted Turner's ultimate fate, end quote. You know, they haven't studied this guy. They just see that ABC has all this money and Westinghouse has all these cable stations and ABC's got Roone Arledge. And, you know, it's the classic startup versus incumbent story, right? You know, where you hear, oh, Google Sherlocked all those apps at Google I.O. Why can't Google make that app? Or won't you be competing with Apple? They just announced all that at Worldwide Developer Conference. Yeah, but you can also differentiate from Apple. You've got dedicated customers. You've got customers that love you. Anyways, and only those who've gone toe-to-toe with these giants really get it. You see, these battles have been happening for as long as capitalism has existed. Longer, probably. And it's always the industry insiders who expect the smaller fish to get eaten. But they should know better, because everyone starts small, and over time, even the sharks develop their own issues, right? Even Forbes admitted that Ted had, quote, done things that no one else could do, end quote. But then they asked how could he possibly survive this against bigger competition and worse odds. And what's funny to me is all of these prognosticators predicting CNN's demise never stop to ask the most important question. If Ted wanted to win, how could he do it? What advantages did he have over SNC? And more importantly, what might go wrong at ABC-Westinghouse that would cause Ted to win? As Charlie Munger always said, invert. Always invert. But the media didn't invert. They just assumed size and money would win and dismissed Ted's chances by default. They overlooked and ignored the drive, speed, momentum, intangibles, grit, tenacity, the things that built CNN, Ted Turner, and his team. He was bringing all of those to the table, which were all the things SNC's joint venture didn't have. And I'm not saying people at SNC didn't work hard. They absolutely did. And here's the wild part. Not one publication mentioned SNC's president, William S. Scott, had no experience whatsoever working with the cable industry. None. And I'm sure he was a good guy, a good executive, but that should have been the biggest red flag of them all. But no one brought it up. They just assumed SNC would win a cable news war. But here's the truth. In the world of cable, it didn't matter how much money or prestige you had. Sure, money matters, but it didn't matter where you went to school or how fancy your resume was. If cable operators didn't carry your channel, you were a polar bear in the jungle, completely out of place, and not long for the world. And you were not long for cable. And guess who had all those cable relationships? That's right, Ted Turner. Cable before cable was cool. And he was ready to fight with everything he had to protect CNN and Turner Broadcasting. Now, when I talked about the logic behind SNC earlier, I mentioned Roone Arledge, legendary head of ABC News, who later said their plan was strong but admitted, quote, our business plan had never met Ted Turner, end quote. That's what a startup with real leadership brings. Unmeasurables, ferocity, tenacity, obsession, and a refusal to quit. Ted was willing to do whatever it took to win. It was his money. It was his baby. ABC, it wasn't, because they didn't need to be great. And that mindset or reality or both, that lack of desperation, it would cost them. In the end, it's decisions like not going all in on SNC that doomed it. And these are the things that the media rarely discusses when they discuss David and Goliath stories. The startup versus the mega corporation. But they should, because speed, grit, and tenacity, they matter a lot. For example, when SNC asked to use ABC News footage, Roone Arledge mandated, quote, raw footage only, and no ABC correspondence on camera, end quote. Arledge also ordered ABC News producers to hold back any possible footage from SNC that might be later useful to the main network. His spokesman told Broadcasting Magazine, quote, our first priority remains the ABC network news operation. our facilities will just supply extra footage for the cable service that won't be in competition with broadcast news, end quote. And then Arledge inserted himself in the article bluntly saying, quote, if Barbara Walters were to interview Ayatollah Khomeini, obviously we would consider that an exclusive for ABC World News Tonight and not something for Satellite News Channel, end quote. Well then, they're not all in. They're basically cutting off their own nose to spite their face. It's as if Facebook bought Instagram and then said, we love you, but you can't use our servers, you can't use our scale, you can't use any of our resources. Imagine that. Here you have a brand new cable news channel owned in a joint venture with ABC and Westinghouse. And Roone Arledge, who has one of the greatest TV minds ever, is running their news division at ABC. And then he tells all those people, sorry, we're one of the best news operations in the world, but you can't use it on SNC. It's insane, but it happened. Before SNC even launched, they were already a second-class citizen inside their own company. Nobody wants to be on the B team, right? And make no mistake about it, if it wasn't clear by now, SNC's news team was the B team. They were the junior varsity, and there was no way around it. Okay, let's talk priorities. Budgets. Who gets those first? ABC News, of course. Top talent. ABC News, of course. Major stories. ABC News, of course. First, second, third, ABC News, ABC News, ABC News. And this kind of internal sabotage, they didn't think it was sabotage at the time, but I can tell you it is. Still happens today more than you would think. It happens because it's exactly how a dominant favorite can eventually get beaten by a leaner, hungrier team that are aligned. Alignment matters when it comes to this kind of stuff. So when Ted found out about Arledge's rules that ABC News footage wouldn't be allowed on SNC, nor would their talent, he knew right then and there, this wasn't just a fight, it was a winnable one. He was basically fighting a strong fighter with one arm behind their back. And Ted didn't hold back, saying, quote, anybody who goes with them is going with a second-rate horseshit operation. Are there any questions? End quote. Now, this was a real competition, execute or die, and Ted knew exactly what to do.
When news breaks, it breaks fast. You can't wait to know what's happening. You need to know now. You need CNN2. CNN2 is a lot of news when you don't have a lot of time. A fast-paced, lively look at your fast-moving world, at sports, business, and weather. But 24-hour CNN2. Up-to-the-minute news every minute of the day. From Turner Broadcasting System.
See the premiere of CNN2 New Year's Eve at 11:45 on Superstation WTBS.
Here, at least on the East Coast, and at this point we'd like to welcome our viewers of the Superstation WTBS and the first viewers watching on Cable News Network 2. This is a special evening for those of us here at CNN and WTBS. We are not only ushering in a new year, we're also inaugurating a revolutionary new service for cable viewers, CNN 2.
And so, on December 31st, 1981, after just 5 months of around-the-clock work, the Headline News team under Ted Mad Dog Kavanaugh was ready for launch. Although Headline News had signed up fewer than 1 million cable subscribers before launch, Ted celebrated the network's New Year's Eve launch in grand style, lighting up the Atlanta sky with fireworks that spelled out CNN 2, 1982. Fran Heaney, whose graphics wizardry helped accelerate Headline News' already frantic pace, said, quote, Mad Dog Kavanaugh had created a news network that wasn't for old people or the hard of hearing or substance abusers. We were simply too fast, end quote. Think about that. Heaney's not saying we were better. That wasn't Headline News' goal. Their goal was to beat SNC to air and to be good enough. Not as good as CNN, but good enough. And when Headline News went live, anchorman Chuck Roberts welcomed viewers saying,
And I'm Chuck Roberts on CNN2. Our two top stories, the ushering in of 1982 in Times Square.
And the birth of America's second 24-hour all-news television network.
In New York City, the kissing and hugging continue.
While some 900 miles to the south, a fireworks display in front of Turner Broadcasting's Atlanta headquarters heralds in the new year.
From there, the news accelerated with Kavanaugh's headline news bombarding viewers with 22 stories in the first 8 minutes on air. 22 in 8 minutes. Fran Heaney remembered, quote, Turner came into the studio shouting and shaking everybody's hand. I knew we could do it, he kept saying. I knew we could do it. Happy New Year, everybody. Then he came over and kissed me. Fortunately, Ted only watched a few minutes of the news and then gathered up his crowd and took them all back upstairs, end quote. Unlike Ted's more balanced news approach for CNN, where they wouldn't just air the bad stuff, Kavanaugh leaned into the age-old tabloid mantra of, if it bleeds, it leads. One critic counted 9 grim reports in the first 20 minutes, including a barge accident in Galveston, an Amtrak derailment, a failed cave rescue in England, a natural gas fire in Oklahoma, a man left dangling from an electric wire in California, a father's tragic attempt to save his drowning son, and a mine disaster in Ohio. Richard Zoglin of the Atlanta Constitution summed it up, quote, so much for Ted Turner's complaints about blood and gore on television news, end quote. By May 1982, CNN had a Nielsen rating of 1.1, and headline news came in unofficially at 0.5, a perfect 2-to-1 ratio. Exactly what Ted and Reese wanted. Headline news wasn't built to compete with CNN, just to blunt SNC, and it was working. Now, in CNN's first 2 years, tensions periodically flared up between Ted Turner, who was the founder and financier, and Reese Schonfeld, its co-founder, president, and the driving force behind all of the editorial. While some called Reese passionate, others might call him difficult. Either way, he was obsessed with what they were building, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but he also wasn't necessarily the easiest guy in the world to work for. Then again, neither was Ted. And when you're chasing a dream this big, making something that has never existed before, taking on the networks, you're bound to get intense about it, right? And honestly, I get it. Ted Kavanaugh later said, quote, working with Reese was no bed of roses. He was a kind of genius. What he did with CNN, but he was never easy to work with. You can check that out with anybody who was there, end quote. And when Reese became more difficult, especially while overseeing an in-house competitor to his own CNN, his baby, it started to attract more attention. He and Ted Kavanaugh barely spoke with each other. Getting approvals for spending became slower and more difficult, and Reese developed a reputation for overspending, which in Ted Turner's world was like a cardinal sin. Overspending, yeah, you don't do that at Turner World. Ted was also growing uncomfortable with Reese's ego, but even more than that, he was worried about something much bigger, the rising threat of unionization at Turner Broadcasting. The National Association of Broadcast Engineers and Technicians, also known as NABET, sent a group to Atlanta to lay the groundwork for a vote to turn Ted's properties into a union shop. With more than 450 staffers in 12 bureaus around the world and more on the way, Ted told Reese plainly, kill the union vote or else. And that or else was serious, because if CNN were a union shop, there's no way it would have survived. Heck, they wouldn't have even launched. Now, CNN was known for low pay, minimum benefits, with many technical roles set up as freelance positions to avoid union conflicts and control costs. Last episode, I explained how they combined a number of jobs that would normally be specific, very tactical union jobs with the major networks, with huge rules and all that, and they combined them into a VJ role for out-of-college employees. But unionization threatened to break that system, and Ted knew it. However, the bigger issue for Reese was his handling of CNN's finances. Though he was praised for keeping expenses under budget, Turner Broadcasting's CFO, Bill Bevins, had grown concerned about Reese's financial decision-making, specifically costly editorial ones like his extended coverage of the Falklands War, or staying in Beirut after all the other networks left, or broadcasting live from Poland during the Solidarity uprisings. And while all of these earned CNN headlines, they also strained the network's budget. Reese's innovative but improvised way of doing things was starting to unravel. When the union vote finally arrived, NABET organizers were confident they'd won over enough of CNN's younger, more politically motivated staff to secure a victory. But as the votes were counted, Reese felt sure his team had his back. Ted? Well, Ted wasn't so sure. In the end, employees rejected the union by a 3-1 margin, which is a major relief for Ted. But he felt it was still too close for comfort. Reese later said, quote, Turner was prepared to fire me on the spot and named Jim Ketchell as CNN's new president if we ever lost that vote, end quote. In fact, it was too close for comfort for Ted, who'd grown frustrated with Reese's managerial style and abruptly fired him on May 16, 1982. Reese reflected, quote, between 1979 and 1982, I ran the game with Ted's money, and we flourished to the tune of 15 million viewers and 1 full rating point. I gambled. I'd staked my life, and I thought I'd won my bet. In 1982, Ted wanted to play his own cards, and for me, that was that. Our wild ride together had ended, end quote. Now, in his memoir, Reese described the breakup more in detail, and here's how he described the ouster from CNN. And while I'm not going to break down every intricacy, nor am I interested in taking sides or re-airing sour grapes, because that's not fair to anybody, but here's a couple excerpts. Quote, in the beginning, Ted and I had been partners. I ran the editorial side, he ran the business side. He was the best partner a man could have. He left me alone, and I got the chance to do things the way I wanted them done. Ted was probably the only man in the world who would have given me the freedom I needed to put the pieces together. Then he added, Ted gave me enormous editorial backing. He never came in and complained about his story. He never worried about displeasing advertisers. Sometimes he wanted me to put people on the air, but when I said no, he may have sulked, but he didn't resist. When CNN was launched, my wife, Pat, congratulated him. He said, what are you congratulating me for? This is Reese's thing. By the second year, I was seeing signs that Ted wanted to make it his thing, end quote. Ted later remarked about Reese's firing, saying, quote, you can't have a 24-hour news network that's totally run by one person. And Reese wanted to make every decision himself. It just wasn't the kind of management style that was going to make the organization strong in the long run, end quote. Fran Heaney put it bluntly, quote, Reese was pretty aggressive, and in those days, kind of a maniac. The TBS people didn't like him at all, but he got what he needed, and without him, there would never have been any CNN, end quote. You see, the thing was, both Reese and Ted, they were both gamblers. Born on the same day, they were both really intense, both visionaries, but at the end of the day, only one of those two guys signed their checks. Reese's friend and ally, Ed Turner, not related, was astounded when he found out, quote, Ted felt he should have been talked to not so much to overrule Reese, but if nothing else, as a courtesy. Reese, on the other hand, felt he had absolute authority to do what he wished. The two men were destined to come unstuck, if only because their operating styles were so similar. Both flew by the seat of their pants, and both were tempestuous, explosive leaders with unusual abilities to recruit and retain highly capable, enormously loyal, immensely dedicated followers. Turner had presented Schoenfeld with a copy of Dale Carnegie's book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, suggesting it might prove useful. Schoenfeld says he never cracked the cover, but as D. Woods pointed out, Reese kept forgetting it was Turner's name on the door and Turner's name on the checks, end quote. I mean, that's a good life lesson right there, right? I think I said this once upon a time. There's always gatekeepers, but there is always a boss. I am the CEO of High Bar, but, I have investors. There's always a boss. Still, Reese's departure shocked the staff. CNN's New York bureau chief, Mary Alice Williams, said, quote, a lot of us felt it was all over. Reese had a professional commitment, a commitment to the news that was probably irreplaceable, end quote. And Daniel Shore agreed, quote, he made it the most exciting time. It was an age of experimentation. Reese would try anything, go anywhere. Sometimes he'd fall on his face, but it was glorious. What the news business is all about, end quote. A few months later, Ted tried to rehire Reese as a consultant, but no dice. A few years later, when Reese was rumored to be starting an all-news channel with NBC, Ted said, quote, I never should have fired Reese. I should have killed him, end quote. Now, that statement alone, coming from someone as competitive as Ted, might be the highest praise there is. Ultimately, Daniel Schwartz said that he didn't think Ted's decision was too difficult, saying that by 1982, quote, Turner was developing a philosophy, a calculated policy of avoiding controversy on CNN. Critics conceded the network was terrific on breaking news and live coverage, but seldom provided any meaningful analysis or commentary. You never got a sense of what you saw on CNN actually meant, end quote. And while Ted and Reese were both risk takers of the highest degree, remember, it's Ted's money and reputation on the line every time. As CNN expanded from an Atlanta outpost to a global news giant, Reese, while a co-founder and president of CNN, well, I guess at the end of the day, you could say he was just an employee. Now, look, there's plenty of he said, she said, back and forth here in this story. And if that's your thing, go check out Reese's memoir. It's very entertaining. It's linked in the show notes and on the Substack for this episode. But for our purposes, let's just say Reese helped build a groundbreaking news network using Ted's money, and now he was out. And Ted? Ted had to keep the pressure on Satellite News Channel, or he would be out too. Headline news was essential in stopping SNC before it ever got going. But it was also one of many things draining Turner Broadcasting's finances, and the stress? It was far from over. By the summer of 1982, CNN's financial situation was dire. They were drowning in debt, still losing $1 million a month and barely making payroll. CFO Bill Bevins, who's kind of a miracle worker for Ted, scrambled for emergency funds from hot dog vendors, cable partners, whoever he could find. Meanwhile, Ted was just trying to keep the lights on. I'm being serious. He was just trying to keep the lights on. At one point, CNN studios were nearly shut down due to unpaid power bills. And yet, throughout all of this, the audience had no idea. They had no clue how dire things were for CNN because everything looked fine. But behind the scenes, CNN was nearly bankrupt, and their biggest competitor yet, Satellite News Channel, was about to go live. Still, if you've learned anything about the cable cowboys, it's that they're a small but strong group, right? So, as calls from nervous cable operators poured in about CNN's finances, Warner Amex approached Ted with an offer. Their offer? That they would handle ad sales for CNN and CNN2 in exchange for exclusive rights to sell ads for CNN and CNN2, or Headline News. They also secured CNN2 a better position on RCA's satellite transponder, moving it from the weaker Western Union satellite to RCA's. On paper, this ad deal sounded like a big win. But this wasn't just on paper and spreadsheets and all that, you know? The paper and spreadsheets people are losing a lot this episode, right? But hey, this is why we play the game. This is why people matter. This is why we roll the ball in the court, pick it up, and dunk it. Because you don't know until you tip off, do ya? Now, in the end, I suppose predictably, Warner Amex's sales team prioritized their own networks, MTV and Nickelodeon, and badly underdelivered, which resulted in poor ad revenue for CNN that brought in just 65% of the revenue they'd been promised. Yikes. It's why it's always a little strange when someone says, yeah, we'll sell all your ads for you. And I'm like, okay, well, how can you guarantee your top effort? Do you know anything about how I want to do things a little bit differently? You know? And for most podcasts, that's normal. Yeah, you can sell my ads. I guess you're bundling them with the rest of your shows, kind of like Vox does. But when you have a guarantee, then things get a little different, right? You want that guarantee, Tommy Boy style. 18 months later, Ted canceled the deal and found another transponder. Still, things were bleak. So bleak that Ted took on a second mortgage on his house and requested, or begged, advertisers for prepayments to keep CNN afloat. Getting a prepayment from an advertiser is no small feat. That's just not how these things usually work. That's like asking for your allowance 6 months ahead of time, right? CNN was barely surviving, and the financial pressures led to constant strain on decision-making. When it came to keeping the lights on, Ted would do whatever it took to survive. By all means necessary, right? But you already know that. Now, after multiple delays from April to May, then May to June, and finally June 1st to June 21st, ABC-Westinghouse finally launched Satellite News Channel on June 21st, 1982, reaching 2.6 million cable households on day one.
This is the Satellite News Channel. Give us 18 minutes, we'll give you the world.
This is your Satellite News Channel. I'm Jose Grignon, and here's what's happening. The long-awaited
June 21st, 1982. A new era in American journalism dawned that day when Satellite News Channel went on the air. We were cable's only all-live, all-news, 24-hour-a-day news service. Our first report, the birth of Prince William, eventual heir to the British throne. Plus the top international, national, and local stories of the day, the latest weather, sports, and business news. Since then, we've established ourselves as the place to turn when news is breaking. Whenever and wherever news happens, SNC has been there first.
And the timing couldn't have been worse for Ted, considering how shaky Turner Broadcasting's finances were, and those finances would remain a major issue as long as SNC existed. Ted needed SNC to go away. But here's the thing. If SNC was such a powerhouse, why would they need to delay their launch so many times? CNN didn't. CNN 2 didn't. Sure, SNC had a better start in terms of cable homes compared to headline news, which only reached 1.2 million cable homes at launch. But now it was up to Ted Kavanaugh's headline news team to prove they were harder, better, faster, stronger. And Mad Dog Kavanaugh was ready. Really? He was obsessed with beating SNC, whether it was airing more stories, moving faster, or bringing more intensity than SNC. He was playing for keeps. Still, SNC's very existence made Ted's life harder. Even though headline news was the better product, the banks, ones extending credit to him, didn't care. Like most of the media, the banks expected ABC-Westinghouse to win. It was just really hard for them to imagine them losing. Not with all their money, expertise, resources. To them, ABC-Westinghouse was a safer bet. These are banks, It's a recession. They don't want to loan bad money out, right? So as long as SNC stayed in the game, CNN faced serious financial challenges. Challenges that meant they couldn't raise prices with cable operators on their carriage fee. Ad dollars were much harder to come by because they're splitting them with SNC. And the financial strain just kept building and building. What I'm saying is this, and this was a big if, but if ABC-Westinghouse were willing to endure heavy losses for a few years, they could actually put Ted out of business. Think about it. That's the power of incumbency, and in 1982, it was completely underestimated. Even though CNN had invented 24/7 news and HLN had beaten SNC to the air, they were still fighting uphill against enormous competition and expectations with a lot of money on the line. By late 1982, CNN 2 and SNC were locked in a brutal ratings war, with both networks making unprofitable deals to grow market share. The rivalry grew bitter, with staff frequently jumping back and forth. Ted even filed an antitrust suit against ABC-Westinghouse, accusing them of making secret deals to keep CNN off cable systems they own. Because Westinghouse owns all these cable systems. Still, Ted had one major advantage: the cable industry's loyalty. At least he thought he did. Most cable operators still back Ted, for now. But they weren't going to subsidize CNN forever while SNC was free. Ted knew if worse came to worse, he had other options. Ones he didn't even want to think about, let alone entertain, but they were available. For instance, he knew CBS had once offered him around $300 million for CNN, and that NBC would likely top that. But that's not who Ted Turner was, right? So if things got worse, an auction for CNN was always an option, or selling off part of it, if it came to that. But that's not who Ted Turner is, and his tenacity hasn't run out just yet, right? Not even close. He still had major advantages over SNC other than the cable operators. And just because they launched, they're on the air, doesn't mean their problems went away, right? Remember, when it came to competing with SNC, Ted's advantages were clear. Faster decision-making, aggressive cost controls, and smarter news gathering. But his affiliate relationships, those might have been his biggest edge. Remember how he and Reese had won over local affiliates in CNN's earliest days, even when it meant going around their parent networks? Well, those relationships came through again. You see, affiliates preferred working with CNN and trusted their national and international news feeds. I'll get more to the feeds in a bit, but here's where it mattered. When SNC launched in June of 1982, fewer than half of their 24 contracted local stations were even online. Meanwhile, Headline News built out its feeds quickly. And don't forget, ABC News never gave SNC their best material. From day one, SNC was technically a priority, but clearly not a big enough priority for Roone Arledge's ABC News to share their stories or top talent. And as expected, things inside SNC started to unravel very fast. The type of problems that never show up on an expert or a consultant's pre-launch strategy memo, like executive indecision, clashing egos, runaway costs, they all piled up quickly. Remember, these are two gigantic companies working together, and in the end, SNC's estimated startup costs before launching almost doubled. Still, before launch, ABC executives expected SNC would, quote, sustain heavy financial losses at first, with a break-even point probably 4 or 5 years out, end quote. That's a long time to keep on telling your investors, right? Hey, we're going to make money soon. But here's my question. What did heavy really mean to them? It wasn't their money, so it wasn't heavy losses as much as heavy pressure measured against time and Wall Street and boardroom expectations, right? And once cable operators saw SNC on the air, what they saw was a subpar, second-rate version of ABC News. And many quickly jumped ship and lined up behind Ted Turner's CNN and Headline News. Mark Nathanson, who represented over 40 California cable systems, told Time magazine, quote, I'm supporting old Ted and sticking by his service. He's here now, and he's sticking. There's no telling how long we can count on SNC, end quote. As it turned out, just a little over 12 months, because while CNN continued to bleed money, SNC was hemorrhaging it. And unlike Ted, they were making no progress against Headline News. What would have been the end for most became a wake-up call for Ted. The pressure and competition energized him. He went on the offensive, showing up everywhere, cable companies, conventions, industry shows, shaking hands, kissing babies, giving speeches, and handing out CNN swag, all while asking for support and reminding cable operators of everything they'd built together. It worked, with more cable operators picking up CNN, while advertisers stepped up their support on CNN and Headline News' superior product. From there, the banks who thought Ted had no chance against ABC-Westinghouse started extending him more credit. Now, the story I'm about to tell you is classic Ted Turner, taking an idea that seems crazy on the surface and then running with it like Secretariat all the way to the winner's circle. In fact, he's kind of the Secretariat of this kind of thing. And in this idea, he actually borrowed this move from Howard Hughes. So here's how it worked. Around this time, CNN's finances were dire. Ted would entertain offers from anyone interested in buying Turner Broadcasting or CNN or shares of CNN, even though he had zero intention of selling. And I'm sure you're wondering why. Why would he do that? Because getting an offer gave him something valuable, a price tag, meaning if CBS was willing to pay $300 million for CNN, well, then it had to be worth at least double that, right? At one point, 3M Corp, I think they're out of Minnesota, thought it had actually bought TBS, only to find out that Ted was using their signed contract as leverage at Citicorp to increase his loan. It's a bluffing strategy, and it worked. The banks bought it, which really improved the company's financial standing. Now, was any of this even legal? I have no clue. Anyways, as TBS's value increased and CNN and Headline News gained traction, SNC kept hemorrhaging money. I'm not going to say they bled money. They were hemorrhaging it, causing ABC's stock to fall. And these are the things, How long were they willing to suffer big losses? That's the thing you never know in a real competition against someone whose entire existence depends on it, right? After a little more than a year competing against CNN, Headline News, and Ted Turner, ABC-Westinghouse had already lost more than $60 million, double what they originally planned to spend. But that wasn't even the full story. Industry insiders put the real number much higher, somewhere between $80 and $100 million, all in 1 year. Yikes. Rick Brown, a staffer for Headline News, described, quote, SNC seemed to be spending too much money in almost every area. They were paying outrageously tremendous salaries. Some of us were amused when one of those who had led a unsuccessful push to unionize CNN said on his departure that SNC was going to walk all over us. Jim Shepard wondered aloud how long it would take the competition to find out they had stolen away all our union organizers. It was typical of the problems the networks had always had. They couldn't imagine anything being done right without overspending on it. Our magic was in cutting down on the bureaucracy, keeping things simple. In many areas, we combined functions. All the experts were saying that if anyone ever succeeds at 24-hour news on cable, it won't be this little guy because he's under-equipped and doesn't know what he's doing. If anyone can do it, it'll be someone bigger, someone heavy on resources and experience. But they mistook the network's bigness and experience for advantages instead of disadvantages. CNN succeeded because it wasn't carrying all that extra baggage. ABC-Westinghouse failed because it was, end quote. My God, that was awesome. That's kind of my thesis on media these days. You've got to be smaller, nimble, you know? Now, back at the beginning of this story, I quoted Rune Arledge in his memoir where he explained the thinking behind launching SNC, saying, quote, Ted Turner wouldn't be able to compete for very long. But I left out the next line of this quote, where Rune admitted, quote, but our business plan had never met Ted Turner, end quote. High praise, game recognized game, right? Rune also wrote Ted was able to stomach, quote, hideous costs, $1 per household just to be carried. He launched a new channel, CNN2, which would become headline news, and he was up and running 6 months before SNC's June 1982 debut. It only came down to which one of us would blink first. 16 months and $85 million in losses later, we and Westinghouse did. Satellite News Channel was sold to Turner for $25 million. After the deal was signed, the gutsy entrepreneur admitted that he was glad we hadn't hung in there for 2 more months. If we had, he said, he'd have been bankrupt, end quote. Timing, sequencing, the stuff matters. Ted didn't beat SNC because he had more money or better news-making capabilities, because he didn't. You know that. Ted beat SNC because he was willing to go further, push harder, and move faster. He made bold decisions the big guys couldn't or wouldn't make. Ted was willing to do what Rune, Goldenson, and every other incumbent wouldn't. Burn the boats, Cortez style. Fight first, survive second, and win third. In the end, despite their deeper pockets, ABC-Westinghouse couldn't justify spending more than double what CNN did to deliver a similar, worse product. Stockholders were unhappy with the higher costs across the board, stemming from unionized labor, bloated teams, and leasing 10 transponders on the West Star 4 satellite, which on its own cost 8 times what CNN spent. Eventually, which was 18 months, their patience wore out. All the negative press, internal pressure, and mounting losses pushed the network towards one decision: shut it down. By October 1983, the writing was on the wall. SNC didn't just lose the battle, they lost the war. So how'd it end? Well, not only did Ted defeat a better capitalized network's foray into 24/7 cable news, but he ended up owning them as well, offering $25 million to buy SNC and their 7.5 million subscribers. ABC-Westinghouse accepted. Now, here's the thing. Did Ted have the money? Of course not. But he needed total victory. And just to twist the knife, so to speak, he told them if they'd held out just 2 more months, he'd have gone broke and they would have had him. Now, do I believe that? Not really. Because Ted would have kept fighting and fighting until his bank account hit 0. He would have sold 10% of CNN to someone, 20%, 30%. You get the picture. Then on October 27, 1983, SNC stopped broadcasting for good. By then, Turner Broadcasting shares had grown by more than 40%. Total victory.
Well, actually, up until this moment, the clock at SNC has always meant another story to chase, the next hour to worry about, sometimes the next minute. Right now, though, it means something else, because the service we used to call the nonstop news machine is about to do just that, to stop for good. Why? Well, business, really, and numbers. Not that there weren't plenty of you. There were millions out there, and some of you were kind enough to say you liked SNC. But the advertising dollars it takes to support a venture like this didn't come fast enough, and they didn't stretch far enough. Maybe we came too soon. In any case, our task right now is to lay the satellite news channel to rest. And so, to paraphrase our old promise, if you'll give us 10 minutes, we'll tell you one last story, our story.
This is the Satellite News Channel. Give us 18 minutes, we'll give you the world.
Stock analyst Bonnie Clark called it, quote, a great deal for Turner no matter how you cut it. He picks up more than 7 million SNC subscribers, which now gives headline news more than 10 million unduplicated households. CNN already reaches more than 21 million. Turner has a terrific new audience to sell to advertisers at rates which he will inevitably increase. But the real gain comes from the fees he is collecting from cable operators. Now they have no place else to go, end quote. Forbes' headline for the deal summed it up. The mouth of the South strikes again, and included a quote from Ted saying, quote, the SNC people were really worthy opponents. They did a good job, end quote. But his humble words were short-lived. He added, quote, you know what we've shown? That on a level playing field, we can beat the networks in cable. CBS came after us with their cultural channel and lost maybe 40 million, and they pulled out. RCA came in with NBC and their cable programming, and they lost as much and pulled out. Now we've beaten a combination of ABC and Westinghouse. It cost them, we estimate, about $100 million. That was all they could take, end quote. And through what he later called the bloody war, one thing never changed: the quality of CNN's broadcasts. Now, even as Ted's team was taking on SNC, it wasn't like that was the only thing going on in Ted Turner's world. There was a lot of other stuff going on. Remember, he never worked on just one thing. He had TBS, CNN, the Braves, and a growing list of environmental nonprofits going on. Easily more than enough for 3 people, let alone one person. But I want to quickly jump back to 1982, when Ted started poking around CNN with one of his favorite skills, repurposing existing material. Remember, for years he'd shown a real talent for finding hidden value in old movies and TV shows when he was building TBS. So naturally he wondered, how could he do the same with CNN? Early in 1982, he figured it out. At the time, CNN's coverage relied heavily on what they called corresponding stations, local affiliates who agreed to cover regional stories for CNN and in exchange got exclusive access to CNN footage for their own newscasts. These stations weren't getting anything close to that from their parent networks, who mostly treated them like second-class citizens, useful for distribution, but not much else. Still, local news was incredibly valuable, and all these local stations had to do was watch CNN hit record and play the footage on their 6 or 11 p.m. news. The system worked. In fact, it worked too well. Soon, based on their success, other stations which didn't have deals with CNN started pirating CNN's footage and airing it on their own local news. That's a good problem, but no one knew it was CNN footage. Of course, this undercut the stations who were playing by the rules, and chaos followed, or as much chaos in 1982 as you can expect from local news. CNN needed a way to stop the piracy, and once again, Ted had a simple, brilliant solution. His first solution to stop the piracy was to add what they call a bug, which is a small version of a logo, CNN's logo to be exact, to the corner of the screen throughout all of their videos to mark their footage, protect their IP and copyright. And, you see these everywhere nowadays. They're on TV, they're on social media. But back in 1982, no one thought to put a persistent bug on all of their TV programming. This bug, which is used everywhere nowadays, let viewers know exactly where the footage came from. And their partners, who were legally using it, were able to show, hey, we have the real footage. When Ted first saw the bug, he loved it, then said, quote, why don't we keep that bug up all the time? It'll let them know what they're watching, end quote. Genius. And thus, the network logo bug has been a mainstay on every TV channel ever since. It's kind of wild to think that it wasn't standard until 1982, but it was Ted Turner who came up with it. Of course, he didn't stop there. Ted saw how badly local stations wanted CNN's newsfeed, so he thought, why not sell it to them? And that's exactly what he did. And he did it fast. CNN News Source quickly became one of CNN's most profitable divisions. Later, when Ted decided to replace the CNN newsfeed with headline news, he knew it was going to ruffle some feathers, especially within the cable industry, but he believed the extra revenue was worth it and that growing headline news' audience would help legitimize their service. He explained this to the BBC, quote, "When I make a decision, I go ahead and make it. If I'm wrong, I admit it and change. It's just like sailing a boat. It doesn't always work out, but with a boat, there can only be one captain or you won't get anywhere. Nelson manned the fleet, didn't he?" End quote. I think we used that quote in the second episode too. Soon after, more than 200 broadcast television news directors, including a third from network affiliates, gathered in Atlanta to hear Ted's pitch for headline news. And Ted told him, quote, "We symbolize the end of network news as you've known it. Before we entered the picture, a station that wanted to include national or international stories on its own news shows was stuck with whatever the networks chose to feed you from their reject pile," end quote. He even quoted CBS's Richard Salent, who admitted, quote, "When we first began, I told our affiliates CBS's newsfeed will be our overset matter, our outtakes, not our best stuff," end quote. Well, Ted said now the best stuff was available to everybody. Quote, "The response was fantastic," end quote. So basically, he's giving them CNN and Headline News' newsfeed later on, and all the networks are giving like the leftovers to all their own affiliates. So, of course, the affiliates are going to pay for better live coverage, right? Exactly. Classic disruption. Courtesy, Ted Turner. It's kind of like an API before APIs, if you think about it. Now, this whole idea of selling a prepackaged syndicated newsfeed to local stations probably doesn't sound like a huge deal, but it was, and it changed broadcasting. For 25 years, the big networks limited what they shared with local affiliates, keeping the best stories for themselves on their national broadcasts. That all changed with the launch of CNN News Source, which allowed local stations to access breaking news from around the world throughout the day, often outpacing their own parent network. As a result, the networks were forced to adapt and started offering more national stories to their affiliates. The lines between local and national news began to blur, and the network shifted towards even more of a focus on feature-style content. Local stations now, with more material than ever to work with, expanded their newscasts, which made local news an even bigger revenue driver. By April 1983, Ted's CNN News Source syndication service reached 150 TV stations, as well as 50 radio stations, another one of Ted's innovations, when he realized that by repurposing the audio from CNN's TV coverage, they could launch CNN Radio, which opened a whole new revenue stream for advertising and made it even harder for potential competitors to catch up. We're talking chess here, not checkers. Ted Kavanaugh said, quote, "CNN was all Turner's idea. None of the rest of us would have thought you could recycle the same material yet again. He's the genius behind all this. Even if we were the people who put it all together, Turner knows how to capture every market, even if there isn't even a market there," end quote. In longtime media journalist Ken Auleta's essays on Ted Turner, he described two of Ted's most essential traits. Quote, "A Houdini-like faith that a rabbit could escape any trap set by a wolf," and "I will die first tenacity," end quote. I like that. "I will die first tenacity." Love it. Ted told Auleta, quote, "I've got a larger dose of motivation than most people have. Some people are born fleet of foot and make great runners. When basic characteristics were doled out, I got more than my share of competitiveness. That's probably all. In fact, it may not be all that healthy," end quote. On another occasion, he said, quote, "I'm like the grass. I get tramped down one day and spring right up the next. Losing is simply learning how to win," end quote. Remember, Ted's proclivity for never giving up, saying, quote, "If we fail does not exist in my vocabulary," end quote. One of the biggest reasons behind Ted's success across various ventures, whether it was CNN, the Superstation, his sports teams, or his cable programming strategy, was summed up by Bob Wright, who later became president and CEO of NBC. Quote, "He sees the obvious before most people do. We all look at the same picture, but Ted sees what you don't see. And after he sees it, it becomes obvious to everyone," end quote. That's like the highest praise I can possibly imagine. Ted was the one who saw the potential to turn a local station into a national superstation using satellite technology. He saw how a 24-hour live news network could work, and then actually did it. He understood that programming was the station's biggest expense and that owning a sports team could provide a steady stream of popular content and community loyalty. You see, talk is cheap and action is everything. Ted didn't just see the opportunity or talk a big game. He acted on it, seized it, and made it a reality. Ted Turner was both a visionary and a risk taker. In CNN's first 5 years, it was anything but smooth sailing. The company was bleeding money, and Ted didn't have the same deep pockets or resources of his competitors. And even when CNN did grow, it was often measured in hundreds of thousands, not millions. Even as cable started to, chip away at the big three networks' viewership, the networks didn't blink. They had over 90% of the audience. So why worry? But eventually, even the critics had to admit CNN had arrived. As the Los Angeles Times put it, quote, "There is no way to be fully and immediately informed without CNN. Ted Turner's scruffy little all-news network has grown up to become indispensable," end quote. Ted hadn't just built a 24/7 news channel. He built an indispensable global service relied on by people across America, Europe, Asia, and beyond. Even world leaders everywhere turned to CNN for their news. Now, when you look at the history of invention and building new products, one thing is clear. If you create something people need, success usually follows. But it's rarely that easy, right? But that didn't mean Ted was in the clear. If anything, his ambitions were just getting bigger. In CNN's first 5 years, nothing was guaranteed other than Ted's tenacity. That was the only sure thing. When asked if he was worried, Ted said, quote, "Sure, I'm worried, but I'm not that worried. As soon as I earn me my $1 billion, I'm going to go buy a network. I'm going to go find the new Frank Capra and set him making movies. I can quit whenever I want to. I am not worried about what people think, but I am the right man in the right place at the right time. Not me alone, but all the people who think the world can be brought together by telecommunications," end quote. Ultimately, CNN succeeded because Ted's bold risk-taking gave him the vision to be first, and he had the guts to act on it. By the end of 1984, CNN had already cost Ted Turner more than $77 million and lost another $9 million that year alone. But by 1985, they finally turned their first profit, making more than $20 million. Now, back in 1982, when Ted first saw his name on the Forbes list of the richest Americans, he saw his ranking and thought, quote, I can do a little better, end quote. Now that CNN had defeated their competition, Ted knew he'd get his chance. You see, he saw his next big move. From the moment Ted got into TV, he dreamed of one thing: owning one of the big three networks. ABC, CBS, NBC, it didn't matter. He said it out loud too, quote, "If we could get our hands on one of the three major networks, which is one of the things I want to do, make an acquisition of one of them and blow the other two out of the water just the way we blew satellite news channels out of the water. I've said that before. Someday, though, I'm going to do it. But don't go out and buy the network stock, because whichever one I get, I would make the other two virtually bankrupt. That's because I could operate so much more efficiently than the others. The networks are dinosaurs." On the next episode of Media Moguls, Ted Turner sets his sights far beyond Atlanta, aiming straight for Midtown Manhattan and the iconic all-black skyscraper known as Black Rock, the very building where William Paley's media empire was headquartered, CBS. On the next episode, we leave the cash behind, raise a mountain of junk bonds, consult with Michael Milken, and launch one of, if not the most audacious takeover attempts in American history. Ted Turner goes after CBS, Columbia Broadcasting System, in the next episode. Until then, I'm Web Barr, and this is Media Moguls, the Ted Turner Saga.